This story is about an old Japanese man who was reborn in another world, and not in any ordinary body, but in the body of the son of an aristocratic family. It was their handsome boy and a young 10-year-old talent. He is the main character in the story. The story tells how he became fabulously rich and happy, but it seemed that the protagonist had never been so wrong before. A pumped-up bearded man with a huge sword fell to the ground and wailed that this was just unbelievable. He thought there was no one in the world better at swordsmanship than their young master. The main character, Kane Carl, was 10 years old, and was the eldest son of the noble Carlier family, and also known for his alchemical powers. Although he looked like a child, he could not be fooled so easily. He was also still a middle-aged man at heart. Kane grabbed his head and was surely aware of the fact that the man was lying to him. His sparring partner thought that they had practiced enough with the sword and released Kane. He was lucky enough to be reborn in the body of a young man who had inherited beauty from his mother. Plus, he was from a noble family, and as a bonus, he was still young. You could tell that he was living just like in a fairy tale. What kind of family he was born into and how handsome he was could determine his entire fate. The world was very unfair at times. The hero was only 10 years old and he already had this ability. He tried to utilize all the elements that are contained beneath the earth and transform anything he could imagine. This was the attribute magic of earth alchemy. Kane leaned into the earth and used the elements of lightning and earth to create a battle sword. The hero picked it up and noticed that it looked pretty good. He was able to recreate the sword because the soil here contained metals. Alchemy was an art where you couldn't create something from nothing. Originally in this world, alchemy was used to create medicines and minerals. For generations, the Carlier family developed medicines in secret to help their country fight epidemics and various degrees of disease. Because of this, they were honored by the crown. Learning swordsmanship and learning alchemy was something he should be able to do as the eldest son of the Carlier family. Kane thought about the fact that he still had time to sleep before noon. The weather was quite nice today, and the boy reflected on his past life. It was the same time he used to sit up till night and work in the office. It was only then that he would go home at rush hour and life was lousy for him. Compared to that world, if he developed properly, he could live this life carefree. The hero turned on his side and thought that this was heaven on earth. He dreamed of becoming even a little bit older so that he could finally have a drink. After a while, the young master's dream was interrupted. A talking dog came to him and said that there was nothing to be done about the young master. The lad was sound asleep and the dog called out to him even louder. Kane jumped up on the spot and noticed the Zen. The dog didn't know what Kane was doing here and assumed some warm water would help him wake up. The hero felt embarrassed and thanked the Zen. Kane sighed heavily and thought about his idol being broken. The cobalt slave named Zen was a dog who was 32 years old. He decided that the guy had gotten completely lazy and remembered himself at his age. At that time, with sweat on his forehead, he devoted himself to study and labor. Zen had previously been a local merchant, but had failed in his machinations and gone into slavery. He was a wise, loyal, and attentive servant. Only at times he could be noisy and annoying. Zen could understand Kane, though, and the young master must have been frustrated. Zen reminded him that not even a dozen days had passed since the passing of his esteemed grandfather. Grandfather Leopold had been a celebrity of their family. In his century, he had gained many territories and was given the status of a duke. But to be honest, Mr. Kane was not much saddened by his death, for they had not really communicated. Until he was 3 years old, he lived with him on the family lands of the Carlier family, and now for 7 years he has been living in the royal capital. But for all people, Grandpa Leopold was a living legend. Kane wondered what would happen to their family when that legend was gone. But in any case, when his grandfather died, all his responsibilities would pass to his father. Kane felt that it didn't affect him and he could only enjoy his life in peace, but Zen didn't like it. And the next day, Kane's father came down with an illness. He became ill with diabetes, gout, and hypertension. His father thought that his body could not stand the daily nightly banquets and fine dining. Kane thought his father was like a seal that had been washed ashore. His father was having a very hard time, and he asked Kane to come closer to him. Kane's father's name was Nicolas Carlier, and he was 50 years old. Kane was uncomfortable, for his father looked as if he might die at any moment. Kane's 42-year-old mother named Louise wanted to know from the doctor what they should do next. The doctor replied that her husband's condition was not good, but all diseases were curable and it would take a long time. Kane immediately realized that at that age he would have to care for his father. The boy clutched his head and was in complete shock, and the doctor asked if he was all right. The hero tried to figure out what he was thinking, because they had plenty of maids to help him. As he left, Kane asked his father not to overexert himself and to rest properly, and his father waved goodbye. The hero decided to take a walk through the streets where everyone recognized him. Merchants were offering the young gentleman a taste of their freshest juicy apples, which had been delivered only today. Another of the merchants offered him cakes. Kane of course loved spending time in the mansion, but walking around the shopping district was just as much fun for him. One could trace how the capital city was bustling with life, as well as taste some amazing things. One of the merchants held a huge fish and invited the lord over. They had a big catch today, and this fish he wanted to carve and bring to their mansion today. Kane's parents were always sitting around doing the mansion's business. The boy didn't understand how they didn't get tired of sitting in four walls. But Zen thought that the young master would someday have to do the same things as his parents, and the lad wasn't ready for that. The hero exclaimed that he would never do such a thing. But considering his father was broken by illness, he would have to do it very soon. Kane looked at Zen sullenly, making it clear that he didn't want to hear about such a thing. Zen came to the conclusion that Kane hadn't changed one bit. He still made no friends and socialized only with merchants and servants. But Kane replied that the gulf between aristocrats and humans was too great, so it was hard to make real friends. Zen understood what he meant when suddenly Mr. Kane was called out by someone. The boy turned back and saw Randolph the salt merchant. Kane was surprised to see the leading salt merchant in the royal capital here and asked what he was doing in such a place. Randolph laughed and said that he was, as usual, hitting the eye rather than the eyebrow. Randolph had just finished chatting with one client and met Mr. Kane on the way. But it seemed to Kane that he was just chilling here, and Randolph replied that he was insulting him. The sun was still too high to be lounging in bars, but it seemed to Kane that he had a lot of free time on his hands. Kane teased Randolph and suggested that he had a lot of free time just because he was single. The rich men in the capital were in no hurry to marry, for there were quite a few women around that were willing to grace their society without a ring on their finger. Randolph exclaimed that he just wanted to find a good woman, and as soon as he met her, he would marry her immediately. But Kane, of course, knew that was a pretty common excuse. Kane reminded him that he was far from young and thus he would become an old man with money and no love in marriage. Randolph stared at the guy and thought he was saying some scary things. He was no longer sure that the young gentleman was really 10 years old, and Kane became uneasy. Kane smiled and thought about the fact that he had met many men like Randolph in his past life. So his day passed and night came upon him. That same night his father called Kane to his room. His mother was beside him, and the father told his son that they were waiting for him. Kane was well aware that this smile from his mother did not bode well. The hero looked suspiciously at his mother and hoped that they were not plotting anything bad against him. The girl laughed and turned away, not understanding why they would do such a thing. Kane found it even more suspicious. The father replied that they wanted to talk to him about the former princess of their kingdom. They thought that marrying her would only bring him happiness. Kane was angry at his father's words and did not want to hear anything about a favorable marriage. Remembering only the image of this girl, the boy thought that there was no way in his life he would marry such a status mare. About 2 years ago, there had already been talk of Kane's engagement to a princess of the Ramers family. His parents were literally willing to sell their son for money and status. The father talked his son into it, remembering how much she liked him. The hero thought of a young beautiful girl and asked them to let him decide for himself who he wanted to marry. Kane also asked his mother to restrain her laughter, for such behavior was unseemly. The girl replied that she would never laugh at him. His mother was an ordinary actress from a theater group and was always in need of money. Even though she ended up marrying successfully and becoming an aristocrat, her lust for money and lucrative partnerships with other families did not fall away. In any case, it was not worth it for the memories of their first meeting to overshadow the present. The hero asked his father to let him at least decide on the marriage himself, and his father noticed that he was a real stubborn man. With that, he went at his mother, and his father said that he had not called him here to discuss a favorable marriage for their family. The boy exclaimed that he was not even hiding his essence. But the father was more serious than ever and told Kane that he wanted to talk to him about serious things like father to son. Unfortunately, his body was afflicted with diseases, but Kane knew that they were not as serious as he had been told and he would surely deal with them. But to Kane's surprise, the doctor advised his father to stay in the capital and receive treatment here. After Leopold, his grandfather, left them, taxes stopped coming from the territory to the royal capital. And as the eldest son of the Carlier family, it was his duty to deal with it. And as of tomorrow, Kane was to go there and fulfill the duties of lord. Kane was in complete shock, but his father thought he was okay with it. But apparently that was not the case at all. Kane would like to remind his father that he was only 10 years old, and his father told him that he was a fairly mature young man. He asked him not to worry, for their family's territory was not as vast as the royal capital. However, it was rich in nature, and the food and wine there were very good. There were 4,000 loyal soldiers waiting for Keiei in the territory, as well as the kind and wonderful people of the lands. No matter how young he was, if he had the talent inherited from his father, collecting taxes from the citizens would be a piece of cake for him. But the boy thought that in that case, they could ask the lord from neighboring lands to collect taxes from the citizens, and his father called his son a fool. After all, if they let other people collect taxes, they could say goodbye to their money. His mother replied to Keiei that this was no joke and his father was right. Working with money could not be entrusted to just anyone, and it had to be done only by a family member. Still, Keiei hoped they would ask someone more responsible, but his father thought he could handle it. After all, he considered him to be the intelligent and capable heir of their family, and such a job he could only entrust to him. Keiei did not know what to say to his father and he was consumed with thoughts. The next day, Keiei and Zen, along with a couple of soldiers, were already on their way to the Carlier family's territory. After 3 days of riding, they finally arrived at their destination, and it was an ordinary peaceful village. It seemed to Xena that the young lord was not impressed with the local vistas, and the hero replied that everything was perfectly fine. A 32-year-old guard captain named Granto greeted Lord Keiei. He was not alone and introduced the inhabitants of these lands to Keiei, who personally came out to greet him. Granto said that all the people were crazy about him, for he was the grandson of their past ruler and Granto was jealous of him. But Keiei was not very happy and thought that in that case they would never let him go home. Since they were crazy about him, the hero would want Granto to serve in these lands with him. Granto was confused and did not know what to answer him. He said that his health had been failing him badly in recent years, especially his stomach. If he changed his diet, he became very ill, but since they had arrived, they should have camped for one night. Granto replied that they had notified the inhabitants to prepare their tents for them on their arrival, and Zen thought that was not all. The servants also needed to prepare to meet the new lord, for it was important for them to see him. But also Mr. Leopold said that it is necessary to give the subordinates and free time, so the audience will be tomorrow. It was not easy, and while the heroes were camping, night fell, but the silence was broken by the screams of Zen, who shouted that they were attacked by bandits. Zen burst into the young lord's tent and actively began to wake him up. He tried to warn him that bandits were here and they needed to escape as soon as possible. The lad sprang from his bed and his sleep was snatched away like an arm. Now Mr. Granto was trying to fight off a whole 100 bandits and the guy was shocked that there were so many of them. The hero thought in horror that they had arrived in their territory and Zen replied that they had. While Keiei was also unclear what they wanted here, but Zen thought it was more important to escape from here now rather than think about such things. The hero reminded him that they should have 25 soldiers armed to the teeth against 100 hungry men, but as it turned out, there were only 5. Keiei was horrified and couldn't understand where the other 20 soldiers had gone. Zen said that they scattered with fear and Keiei found it hard to believe that they were soldiers. The fleeing soldiers were hired in the royal capital. They had no duty or desire to give their lives for Lord Keiei. They were not paid enough to risk their own skin and as a result they fled fearing for their lives. Keiei decided that he was being bullied and now he could die by bandits in a place like this. On the other hand, the Granto Guard commander hired in the royal capital did not flee from the battlefield, all because his relatives lived in those lands. If he had fled cowardly, his family would have been hanged for betraying the Carlier family, because he had failed to save the heir by his behavior. All that was left for the remaining 5 knights was to fight until the young lord fled the village away. It was for this reason that Granto did not want to come here and one of the soldiers might have agreed with him. But no one knew that would be the case. Whether they would win or lose was no longer important and Granto ordered the boys to advance. He was determined to take them to the grave with him. From the forest came the shouts of soldiers and Zen asked the young lord to run even faster. Earlier his father had told Keiei that 4,000 loyal knights would be stationed here, and that the people here were kind and wonderful. In that case, Keiei did not understand where 100 bandits came from in this land, and how it was possible to collect taxes from the people who suffered the attacks of bandits. The hero was angry with his father and decided that as soon as he got home, he would give that seal a beating. Keiei was cursing and thought about how his legs were no longer holding him up. The hero didn't realize how much he had already run or if he had been able to escape from the bandits. Only now he thought that he had been appointed the local lord. His carriage was engraved with the crest of the Carlier family, which meant the bandits understood who they were attacking. If it were them, it would be logical to run away without getting into a fight. But in the end, Keiei himself ran away from them, fearing for his own head. Keiei tried to catch his breath, but decided he couldn't run any further and consciousness began to leave him. Keiei closed his eyes and heard a voice calling him, ordering him to get up. The boy had absolutely no idea what it was saying. The hero jumped up from the ground and waved his hand away, ordering the incomprehensible voice to be silent. Keiei was surprised to see an old man with a torch in front of him, who could not understand what Keiei was doing in such a place and at such an hour. It seemed to them that the guy was a girl. Moreover, he smelled pleasantly. The hero sat with his back to them, and most likely, because of his handsome face, long hair, and perfume, they mistook him for a girl. The old man was not alone, and there were about 4 or even 6 people with him. Keiei realized that he could not do anything against them with his fighting skills. The old man asked him not to worry and promised to help him. The hero didn't know what to do in such a situation, and he obviously didn't have time to think. After all, if he did nothing, he would surely be in danger. Keiei didn't know whose voice had awakened him, but it didn't matter now. If he recalled, this land was rich in iron, and since that was the case, the guy decided to use alchemy. The old man inquired about his well-being, noticing that there was something wrong with the supposed girl. First of all, he needed to use minerals to escape, and the guy used the magic of alchemy. A group of people couldn't understand what was going on and noticed the ground beneath their feet began to explode. During the commotion, the hero was able to climb up a tree, and the people realized that Keiei had disappeared. He had no reason to flee in case they caught up with him again as well. In that case, Keiei waited for a group of people to get closer to his tree, and used the magic of alchemy. A stream of lightning went through the trunk of the tree and struck all the targets below. The hero used transmutation alchemy, and the entire ground became covered in electricity. The pursuers could not understand what was happening, for everything around them glowed. Eventually, the lightning transformed into a grid that locked the people in a cage. There were 25 iron bars on each of the 4 sides, and the pursuers demanded that Keiei let them out. Considering the length of the bars, it was comparable to a hero creating 100 swords at a time. Keiei could barely stand on his feet, but nevertheless believed that he would now be safe. His body became heavier, and he had not felt his legs for a long time. He even had to cross a river, but he felt only cold and his body temperature was rapidly decreasing. The guy walked some more distance and reached a big wide tree where there was an opening. Climbing inside, the hero hoped that he would be alright and that he would not die here. While the protagonist was sleeping in a tree, he heard voices behind him and was afraid that those same old men had found him. The boy jumped up from his seat and asked who was here. Keiei felt embarrassed as he realized he had managed to scare the kid. The little guy screamed first, and then stared at Keiei unhappily. He wanted to know who the Keiei was and what he was doing in someone else's garden. The hero stared questioningly at the boy, not knowing what he was talking about. Keiei apologized and explained that he had gotten lost last night and came here, but the boy said he didn't answer his question. Keiei was interested because they were about the same height as him, and Keiei had one suggestion for the boy. The boy was surprised that Keiei wanted to give him his clothes, and the girl told her brother that he looked pretty cool. The boy was surprised and decided to make sure the boy was sure of that. But Keiei smiled and gave him his stuff. Plus, the hero wanted to thank them for letting him spend the night in their garden and for letting him exchange clothes. Pulling on his shoes, the hero thought they were the perfect same size, and that was great. Keiei mentally apologized to the guys, but if he didn't blend in with the crowd, those people would figure him out quickly. He waved goodbye and said he had to go, but the kids didn't realize where he was going. Finally, Keiei offered to tell the adults that the forest fairy had given him these clothes and said goodbye to the boy. The boy waved goodbye and decided to remind them that they were the same age as him. After a while, Keiei made his way out of the forest and walked toward the village. The dirty and smelly clothes he was wearing were perfect, and he had come up with a pretty good idea. Now he wasn't looking like himself and assumed that most likely the bandits would mistake that guy for him and kidnap him. But Keiei tried to reassure himself that they wouldn't kill him, and would most likely just interrogate him and let him go. Also, Keiei should have found his grandfather's mansion, but he didn't see how he would do that. The hero decided that he would first get some sleep and then start asking the locals, and turned on his side. At that moment, the guy noticed someone's feet in front of him and jumped with fright. He fell down the slope and a female voice asked him what he was doing in such a place. While the girl asked if he was alright, the hero didn't understand why the place smelled like donkey dung. The girl in the maid costume laughed and apologized, but this was no place to lay around. Only now did Keiei notice that it was a maid in front of him. She was really sorry, for she thought it was the village tomboy again, shirking his work. She put a handkerchief to the lad's face, and Keiei noticed that her clothes were of pretty good quality. She looked to be about 15 or 16 years old. There were no age spots or freckles, and her skin was completely white. It felt like she was definitely not a village maid. The girl noticed Keiei's gaze on her and assumed something was wrong. The maid poked his cheek with her finger and thought about the fact that she hadn't met him in this village before. Keiei waved her away and asked her to stop it, and the girl laughed. The maid also suggested that one of his parents worked at the Carlier mansion, and Keiei immediately jumped up when he heard about his grandfather's mansion. Keiei began questioning her about where the mansion was located and how she knew about it. The maid smugly replied that of course she knew about it, because she worked there and just decided to stop by her parents' house before work. The maid took a closer look and noticed that the boy was quite handsome. But the boy blushed and asked only to be shown the way to the mansion. The maid didn't understand what he was going to the Carlier mansion for, because earlier he had mentioned that his parents didn't work there. But the guy didn't understand what she cared, and the girl laughed again, saying he was funny. In that case, the girl suggested that they should go together, for as she thought it would be difficult for a small child to cross the mountain on his own 2 feet. Keiei opened his mouth in surprise and thought he was very lucky. Besides, the maid assumed that he was hungry and she had a home nearby. She wanted to run in and get him something to eat. The mansion also had tea and sweets and she could give him a treat. The hero was already drooling thinking about food, because he hadn't eaten a crumb since the evening before, and that would be good. But then he decided to stop a little. He decided to think about what a carriage was doing here, and one carriage for one maid looked ridiculous. He assumed that he could be attacked again on the way, and here he didn't even have a bodyguard. Keiei thought back to the bodyguards, Granto and the rest of the soldiers. He also noticed that there was no Zen with him, since they were together and the guy couldn't figure out where he had gone. Keiei apologized and said that he couldn't go with her, for he had one urgent matter left to attend to. He would just like to know how he could get to the mansion. The maid was surprised that he could not go with her and asked him to wait here. She ran to the carriage, took the map and went back. The maid handed the map to the hero and said she was giving it to him as a gift. The guy was very grateful to the maid and ran about his business. The girl was surprised and wished him well and farewell. She thought the Keiei was quite polite but strange. Keiei realized that if things had already settled down, Zen would try to get back to their camp and the rest of the soldiers. Still, the hero managed to regret refusing to eat 1,000 times. He imagined the maid feeding him desserts for tea, and he drooled. He tried to stop thinking about the missed opportunity to get home in comfort. While the lad was in his thoughts, someone called out to the young gentleman and the lad jumped up on the spot. It turned out to be Zen, and Keiei apologized to him for running away, leaving him alone. The guy didn't notice when a hand was placed on his shoulder from behind and said they were looking for Lord Keiei. Keiei was horrified that there was blood on his body and hands, but the soldiers asked him not to worry about them. Granto laughed out loud and admitted that they hadn't had such a sweaty workout in a long time. But one of the soldiers didn't understand why he was being brave. Keiei also thought about the fact that the bandits had blown out the rest of his brain. The boy walked over to the Zen and stroked his head and asked for forgiveness for that. He was glad that everyone was unharmed, and more importantly, that they all survived. The group was lucky enough to meet before the mountain pass, and they were already all headed to the Carlier family's mansion together. The hero didn't understand why he needed to change his clothes, but Zen thought it suited him. Granto bowed to Lord Keiei and expressed regret for what had happened to him because of them. But Keiei thought they did a great job and thanked Granto for their labor. Granto thought that they could not atone for what they had done, but Keiei did not realize this. Keiei felt that he should be thanked for it, and he would now live here and perform the duties of his bodyguard. Granto could barely hold back tears, and the guy said he was joking. After all, Granto clearly didn't like it here as much as Keiei did. The butler of the Carlier family named Sebastian came out to meet Keiei. The 65-year-old butler bowed to the young gentleman and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The butler hoped that the lord recognized him, and Keiei remembered him as Sebastian the butler. Even though it had been 7 years, he still remembered him. Keiei told him that his father had handed over the administration of the territory and asked for his help in the matter. Sebastian agreed and promised to help him in any way he could, though not for long. Keiei would work as a lord on the lands and would welcome any help he could get. Sebastian thought the young lord was tired from the road and suggested that they discuss the matter later. Keiei admitted that he was right and the lad was a little tired. In that case, Sebastian asked to follow him. Keiei realized that after resting, he had to deal with the tax collection problems. In this mansion, his grandfather Leopold was living out his last days. The main work flowed far from here, but at Lynn Garden. And during the deterioration of his grandfather's health, his great-uncle Earl Louis took care of all his affairs. But his great-uncle was also very old and ill. It was not surprising that Keiei's father decided to hand over the administration of the territory to him and not to torture the old man any longer. Of course, this was impossible for an ordinary 10-year-old, but it was worth keeping in mind that this body contained the soul of a 35-year-old man. Therefore, Keiei decided that he could definitely do well here. Suddenly, a dazzling glow appeared in front of the guy's eyes and he was greeted. The girls bowed and greeted Mr. Keiei from the bottom of their hearts, and Sebastian said that they were the maids of their mansion. There were quite a lot of them, and Keiei found it hard to believe that all these maids worked here. Besides, they were not easy maids and any one of them was beautiful. The approximate age of the maids was 20, but there were also young children of 5 or 6 years old working here. It did not occur to him how such a little girl could work on a lord's estate. Keiei even speculated that his grandfather, Leopold Carlier, who was a legend and lord of the land, was simply a lollipop man who used alchemy to make his maids younger and more beautiful. Zen noticed that there was something wrong with the guy, but Keiei just hesitated and asked him not to take it into his head. The hero also noticed one of the maids who was familiar to him. He came closer to her and looked into the maid's eyes, but the girl was so uncomfortable that she turned away, avoiding the lord's gaze in every way possible. The maid trembled and Sebastian assumed that something was wrong with the young master, but Keiei replied that everything was fine. The other maids immediately began to inquire what was wrong with Alien, for this boy was looking at her so diligently. Keiei thought that she had no idea that a boy in rags, dropped in the ground with donkey dung, would turn out to be the new lord and her master. Sebastian bowed and said he would bring all the necessary documents regarding their holdings and asked her to wait for him here. When Sebastian returned and apologized for the wait, Keiei was shocked at how much had piled up, but it was only a small part of the entire mountain of documents that he was able to carry away. Keiei realized that he would spend more than a day on them, just reading them, and asked him to tell him briefly why the taxes of the lands had not been coming into the capital since this fall. In that case, Sebastian decided that it would be easier to show everything than to tell. He asked to follow him, but Keiei did not understand what he meant. Keiei asked Zen to go with him and Zen agreed. As they went down the stairs, the hero remarked that the estate was quite huge and Sebastian replied that Keiei was undoubtedly right. The butler led the heroes to the safe containing the property and money of the Carlier family. The hero suggested that he might go in there, and Sebastian opened the doors for him. Zen and Keiei were shocked at the sight of the empty safe and did not understand why it was completely empty. Keiei became uncomfortable and thought it was some kind of joke. Sebastian replied that this was unfortunately not a joke and Keiei was horrified. At this point, all they had was a debt of 500 million pounds. The guy tried to calculate how much that would come out to in yen, and didn't understand how anyone could even get such a huge debt. The past lord was incredibly talented at making money, but completely inept at handling it. Keiei didn't understand how his grandfather could have gotten such a debt if he was famous as a legend and a great manager. Besides, he was in good standing with the royal family, but it was just because he was a legend, but Keiei didn't know how to understand it. The former lord was a fine knight and was willing to come at the first call of the royal family. He performed many feats, quelled a rebellion, and rid their lands of barbarians. The hero heard that he was not satisfied with the cynicism of the king, for their ruler was not afraid to use the lives of innocent people for his own ends. Seeing this cruelty, their past lord never wanted to be such a ruler. He treated the inhabitants of his lands as his children, exempting them from taxes, paying them himself. In bad harvest years, he opened storehouses and supplied the needy with food. He also established many convents for orphans who had lost their parents in the war and made generous donations. Keiei thought he was being joked about, but his grandfather was also famous abroad. Merchants tended to come to him, selling goods at low rates. The hero assumed that his grandfather was thus spending all the money to help the people of his lands, but that was not the case. In truth, there was more to it than that. The current head of the Carlier family, Nicolas Carlier, demanded that his father send him huge sums of money every year. His grandfather felt guilty towards Nicolas, for he had left him at an early age to do his duty, so he continued to send money to his son. The boy was shocked that his father demanded 5 million pounds every year to live in the capital. Keiei found it hard to believe that this seal demanded that much money every year, but that was the way it was. Simply put, his grandfather paid taxes for his own residents, tried to make their lives easier, and sent money to his only son, who didn't hesitate to spend it and sometimes got into debt, requiring his father to pay it off. This is how the legendary lord lived his life. Whichever way you look at it, Keiei thought it was a bit of an outrage. He decided that as soon as he got back to the capital, he was going to screw the damn seal. Zen asked the young lord to calm down, and the boy decided he was right. He only had one question left to ask. Not only were all the maids in the manor very young, but in addition each of them was a beauty, and he didn't understand what that had to do with. Keiei doubted that they could have been mere maids, and Sebastian decided that he would rather see once than hear 100 times. Keiei and Zen glanced among themselves and headed after the butler. Keiei walked forward and asked Sebastian what he should do next. The butler stopped and held the Zen near him. Sebastian apologized and said that he and Zen could not go any further, but Kane did not understand why. The thing was that only a lord could enter this part of the mansion, hence only the young lord, although he was a temporary lord, but there was nothing to do, so the lad agreed. Kane asked Zen to wait for him here, and the dog asked the young lord to take care of himself. He spoke as if Kane would meet some monster there, but he wasn't going to run away from it. The hero walked further down the corridor and opened the wide doors. Here was the same mansion, but it looked completely different. This part was quite clean and luxurious. If asked, Kane would have described this place as a woman's wing. Although that was his guess, he still didn't think he could have guessed so easily. He smiled when he saw a luxurious dining table where beautiful girls were sitting and drinking tea. Kane wanted to say hello to them, but the girls, for whatever reason, got up from the table and scattered around. The guy felt awkward and couldn't understand what was going on. Suddenly, Kane recognized them as the same maids who had greeted him. But the way they looked at him now was quite strange. Their faces read surprise and confusion, and their cheeks were flushed. Their behavior and revealing dress were strange. In addition, they were not engaged in maid duties, but sat and had tea. One would have thought that the hero had entered a brothel. Kane turned around and headed back toward the exit. Kane asked Sebastian in shock what was going on here, and the butler replied that they were the young master's maids. But Kane knew what he had seen, and these girls did not look like maids. Sebastian asked the young master to calm down, for this was indeed the maid's wing. He had not given notice that they would be visited by the master, and apparently he saw their usual occupations. However, it all depended on how he viewed the situation, and Kane apologized for being indignant without thinking. He just needed more explanation. The whole point was that they also worked as concubines as well, just as Kane thought they would. Lord Leopold was a living legend and a virtuous man, and was always generous to everyone around him. Naturally, the lords from neighboring lands dreamed of inbreeding with such a man and sent their beautiful daughters to these lands as concubines. Unfortunately, because of his position, and so as not to aggravate conflicts between other territories, he could not send these girls back. As a result, he began to accept each girl and did not send them back, but allowed them to live here. No matter what age a girl was or how many of them lived here, he accepted them all. Sebastian also heard that Kane's father, Mr. Nicola, was ill, and it was unlikely that they would have the opportunity to have a brother or sister. So now Kane had a great chance, because he was young and could conceive an heir now. Sebastian therefore wished that the boy would not drive the girls away, and assured them that they would respond to his kindness and generosity. But Kane hoped that Sebastian was not serious, and besides, he was still too young. The boy asked how many concubines ended up living here, and it was 87 women. Kane was shocked and apologized to Sebastian, but he had heard enough and wanted to be alone thinking about what he had seen. They ended up with a debt of £500 million and 87 concubines. The area was literally on the verge of collapse and they were almost bankrupt. He remembered that the city of Udara owed the government 30 million yen and they were still paying off that debt. Kane had no idea how long he would have to do this. Zen assumed that the young lord was intimidated by that debt figure, and the guy reminded him that it was 500 million and he'd never seen that kind of money in his life. Zen looked at the lad in surprise and told him that there were many merchants in the royal capital who dealt with larger sums every day. Kane looked at Zen in surprise and Zen said that was true. Zen decided that the morning was wiser than the evening and Kane should have eaten and gotten a good night's rest first. The main thing he had to remember was not to make more enemies around him. The hero pondered his words and decided that he was right. He should have gotten the strength to deal with all of this. In that case, Zen said that was enough for today and it was a good time to rest. Kane was shocked when he saw the dinner table, for he just wanted to eat and didn't expect to see such a thing. The maids offered him a variety of dishes in the form of chicken or avocado salad. One of the maids wanted to feed him from a spoon, and another offered him a taste of soup. A third maid wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, saying that the gentleman had soiled himself. All the maids waited for his order that he would be next, but Kane confessed that he was already full. Kane headed for the bathhouse and sat down on a bench. He had no idea that they would descend on him like bees on honey, and each one needed to approach him. The hero sighed heavily, for he hadn't even been able to taste the food. He should have been happy to be surrounded by beauties, but still he also wanted to be in peace and quiet. The hero came out of the bathhouse and felt that he only ended up more tired after eating. In that case, Zen suggested that he should rather go to bed. Zen wished the young lord good night, and Kane did not realize what the fancy nightgown he was wearing was. But he didn't care about that at all now, for he just wanted to go to bed and collapsed on the huge bed. There were high ceilings, a huge bed, and the amount of debt was also huge. Kane just couldn't stop thinking about it. In the middle of the night, the door to Kane's room creaked open and the guy kept his sword under his pillow at the ready, pretending to sleep. He knew Zen was sleeping in the other room, and he certainly wouldn't enter his grandfather's chambers without knocking. The hero assumed that it was probably some peasant who had come to take revenge on the current lord for not doing a damn thing, or the bandits that handled the nights outside, or perhaps they were accomplices from the beginning. But Kane was prepared for this and only waited for the unknown man to come closer to him. Suddenly a violent cramp seized on his leg, and the lad did not understand why it was happening now. It was probably due to the extreme fatigue of the whole day. Kane felt creepy, because this strange man had managed to get under his blanket. Now was the time to attack him while he thought Kane was asleep, and the hero decided it was now or never. The boy pounced on the stranger and heard a woman's voice. His hand lay on something soft and smooth and the guy blushed. He also heard a very strange sound. He asked the man to move away from him and threw him off the bed. The guy grabbed the lamp, trying to figure out who the man was and what he had forgotten in his room. Seeing the girl in front of him, the hero blushed and asked what she had been doing for the night. It turned out that the girl had come to perform her nightly service and introduced herself as Aileen. She was fully at his master's service. The hero reminded her that he was only 10 years old, and she surely realized that at 10 years old it was a little early for night service. The girl blushed and lowered her gaze, saying that if she didn't, she would be told off. In addition, she would be ridiculed for failing in her duties, and Kane recalled Sebastian. Apparently, the butler could not understand the fact that he did not need to. The hero asked the surprised girl to go back to her wing and promised to talk to Sebastian. The girl did not know what to say to this and cried, but Kane did not understand her reaction, for he was not going to do anything to her. But that was exactly the reason why she cried. It made sense to Kane, for many years they had lived this way, and if they were rejected by the Lord, in all likelihood it would affect their reputation. The hero asked her not to cry and apologized for pushing her away. He held out his hand to her and suggested that she come up to him, for the estate is quite cold at night, and she would catch cold in such a state. The girl sat down beside him and the hero became uncomfortable. He asked the girl to say her name again, and the maid introduced herself. The boy guessed why Sebastian had sent her to him. Earlier in the morning, Kane had scrutinized her closely because he recognized her, and the other maids must have known she had gone to him. In that case, he could not send her back and offered to spend the night with him. Besides, the bed was pretty huge and they could just lie on either side and not disturb each other. Kane felt uneasy when he saw the tears in her eyes again and didn't understand why she was crying again. Finally, they settled down and the boy was clueless as to what was on the girl's mind at that age. He assumed that from living in such a place for so long their perception of the world had become distorted. While indeed and in spirit he was just a regular old man who tried to show sensitivity and respect to her, in body Kane was too young for such a thing. He mentally apologized to the young lady who slept across from him. The next morning, a surprised Aileen got out of bed. She realized that she had fallen asleep here and in all likelihood they had had nothing. For Aileen, this was the first time she had shared a bed with a man. Unfortunately, she had been given to the mansion when Grandpa Leopold was too old for such pleasures. Still, Aileen had been preparing for this for quite some time, and Kane didn't even suspect anything about it, sleeping with such an innocent expression on his face. The girl looked at the young lord and puffed up her cheeks resentfully. While Aileen was in her thoughts, the other maids would want to ask her for the details. They were curious to know everything, so they asked Aileen if she had taken away the boy's innocence. The girl blushed and did not understand how Linda could ask such a vulgar question. But the other maid smirked slyly and suggested that Gertrude also wanted to go with Aileen to the lord. But the girl waved her hands away and tried to prove that she had said no such thing. Linda was quite curious about how much dignity the young lord had and questioned Aileen about it. She hoped that they had everything and the other maid became embarrassed. She thought it was a good idea for Linda to wash her mouth with soap and water, though Aileen was lucky to be the first to get into bed with him. But now it was the turn of others to be there as well. The maids looked at Grace in surprise and Linda couldn't find words for her friend. Grace said that Aileen was lucky that the young lord had bought her milking. But the truth was that by rights richer concubines should have been the first to sleep with him than a beggar like Aileen. The girl gave the maid a disgruntled look and looked embarrassed, but Grace thought she was just complimenting her body. She smirked, not understanding why Aileen was so displeased. She'd only been lucky enough to get the favor of Kane-san once, and Grace wished that Aileen wouldn't get cocky. But another maid thought Grace was offended that Mr. Kane didn't even look at her, and Aileen looked fearfully at the bold Scarlet. But the other maid said that she and Mistress Grace had been summoned directly by the young master, so there was no need for them to argue with losers like them. And so 5 days had passed since Grace and all the maids from wealthy families had received their assignment from Mr. Kane. Grace and the girls never returned to the wing, and Aileen wondered what they were doing there. It was the first time any of the maids had been gone for so long. One of the girls suggested that something might have happened to them since they hadn't been back for so long. The only way to find out where they were was to ask the young master directly, which Aileen decided to do. Kane replied briefly that it was an abbreviation, but Aileen didn't understand what it was. To make a long story short, the lad gave them away to the merchants of the capital to be married, and Aileen snapped out of her seat, thinking she should do it too. But Kane asked her to calm down. He approached the maid and asked her to listen carefully. Their lands were on the verge of bankruptcy, or rather they were already bankrupt. To cut costs, he decided to give Grace and 45 other maids to be married off. The girl was shocked when she learned that the maintenance of 87 concubines amounted to about £5 million a year. It was cosmetics that accounted for half of this spending, so he gave those who used it most often. And now that Aileen had found out, she was automatically his accomplice, and Kane gloated at the girl. But now he would load Aileen with even more work, and the girl asked to rely on her. The lad turned to Zen and said that he was also concerned, and the dog listened to him. Now that Grandpa Leopold is dead and Nicola is sick, most of the concubines are out of work. So Kane decided to ask around his fellow merchants from the capital if they needed a beautiful bride, and they agreed to take some of the concubines as wives. According to the merchant's logic, a girl who lived in the countryside is less fastidious and demanding than one who has lived in the capital all her life. Thus, in just 3 days, Grace and 45 other concubines were successfully married off to wealthy merchants from the royal capital. And now the hero was left with 42 maids, and he reduced their number by as much as half. This left girls of 15, 16, and one girl of less than 10 years of age. All of them are about his age. Of course, he could have made more cuts, but such a thing might make the other families rebel against it. It was somehow not difficult to suppress this matter, but he had no desire to deal with the consequences of such a thing. Kane decided to abandon the thought and better think about the others. The concubine maids, Sebastian, and a couple of guards now lived in this mansion, but keeping them here was not a good idea. The soldiers were also old men who were almost over 50 years old. Granto and the other 4 young warriors returned to the capital, and he was left with only the former cobalt merchant. As the hero thought, he stared at the Zen, and the dog assumed something was wrong with the young lord. The hero didn't like the Zen's form for some reason. Zen replied that he was rather short on time, that he hadn't had time to change his work clothes. And the hero had a great idea. Kane had one special errand for Zen, and Zen was eager to see what he could do to serve his master. First, he needed to sort through all the books in the library. Only the books on land stewardship were to remain in the library, and the rest could be gotten rid of. Also, Kane wanted to give Zeno the key to the storehouse. Besides all of his father's junk, the heirlooms of the Carlier family were to be stored there, and the value of each had to be estimated. Zen was surprised that it would be up to his discretion to decide all of this. The hero smiled and said that back in the royal capital he had realized that his eyes could not be deceived. He counted on Zen, and Zen's eyes lit up. The dog asked to rely on him, and he decided to get on the case right away. The hero stretched and decided that it was a good time to look around his property, but no sooner had he thought about it than it started to rain and a thunderstorm began. The boy went outside and was shocked. He didn't understand why it was raining like a bucket outside. In such a downpour it was undesirable for him to leave the mansion, and Sebastian had warned the lord about it. And now all his plans had gone down the drain. The boy also noticed that it was much colder here than in the capital, and he shuddered. Sebastian threw a blanket over him and asked him to warm up in his chambers. Meanwhile, as Kane was warming himself by the fireplace, he did not understand why it was so cold, and Sebastian offered to make tea for the young gentleman. The lad thanked the butler and agreed. Eventually, it rained for about 10 days, and because of this sudden event the lands of Kane were seriously damaged. Dozens of villages were destroyed by the flood. But the worst hit was the warehouse where the fall harvest was stored, and it was completely washed away by the water. The hero assessed the damage on a map of the kingdom and decided it was a real nightmare. Not only was he bankrupt, but now it felt like he had started a game of territory exploration on hard mode. He had zero security and wasn't sure when he would be attacked again by bandits. Keiei was without means, with a huge debt, and he didn't have the trust of the residents either, nor did he have reliable vassals. It was a completely hopeless situation. He would have said so without possessing alchemy. While he was in his thoughts, Aileen brought Mr. Keiei some tea. The boy apologized and asked Sebastian and Aileen to leave him alone. At the moment, he lacked information about the area. Knowing her, he would be able to get out of this situation. The hero wished he had a territory status screen, for example, like in the game, and if he could do something like that, that would be great. Suddenly, Keiei was blinded by a strong glow and covered his eyes from the unbearable light. When Keiei opened his eyes, he was quite surprised to see before him the very table of the state of his kingdom. But he was even more amazed by the little angel who explained to him that it was a visualization of the current state of his family's lands. The boy was frightened and wished he knew who she was. He swung his hand to catch her, but the angel was once again at his back. The hero assumed it was some new kind of moth, but moths didn't talk, and the angel said it was rather rude. She called him a petty boor and thought that for decency's sake he might have compared her to a butterfly. But anyway, he saw her as some kind of insect and said he was busy so she could leave. Even suggested that he might have dreamed what she was saying. The little girl made sense, and that was how he thanked the deity who had saved his life. Keiei could not believe that she could have been the deity, and admitted that it was a good joke. But the little angel smiled and said that it was all true and she was the mother of a Carlier land goddess named Opraya. And as he, little Keiei, became the new lord of these lands, she gave him her blessing to help him develop the territory. But this was the first time the lad had heard of such goddesses, and Opraya was shocked that he didn't remember her, for she had saved his life in the forest. And then the hero remembered that someone had tried to wake him up when he was wandering through the forest earlier. He remembered her annoying voice that woke him up and thought that everything was logical. He was tired and thought he was hallucinating again. The girl said that she was a deity, and the hero wondered what she was after. Since she was the mother goddess of the land, she would want her home to prosper. Keiei could understand her and in that case asked her to help her out of this crisis, but the girl said she had already helped. Keiei did not understand what she meant, and the deity asked to see the visualization of the territory that she had made. But Keiei replied that this panel would not make him money and asked her to grant a cheater skill according to the classics that would help him get rich. But she had no such, and she could just counsel him and give him valuable advice. But Keiei thought it was useless bullshit. For that matter, the hero asked her to at least talk about the panel and the girl agreed. It was clear with the population and the number of inhabitants in an area. His balance was also minus, and he himself guessed why. The faith of the people was the parameter responsible for the faith of the lord of the land. Personal reputation. His reputation as a man among the inhabitants. Health was responsible for the level of security in his territory. Flood defense showed whether the rivers were out of channel or not, while the agriculture, commerce, and businesses on the land remained at the industrial level. But Keiei thought that his numbers were not that low. For comparison, he decided to take one of the best areas in the south of Bartholomew. There, the indicators came out well over 80, so she slightly even pleased him. At the moment, among all the lands of the Ramses kingdom, they were at the bottom of the hierarchy. But Keiei thought that there were even worse territories, and that was a given. But being the mother goddess of these lands, Opraya would want Keiei to develop this territory. She said that if he labored, his numbers would increase, but if not, they would be at rock bottom. If he labored and developed the territory, he would come closer to prosperity and she would increase her status. It was quite a bargain, and Keiei said she was quite a talker. But only he realized that she would never do anything useful for the territory in the end. On the 11th day, the rain finally stopped. Sebastian asked the young gentleman where he was going, and the lad replied that he had wasted a lot of time, and it was time to explore the territories of the Carlier family. But for this he needed a guide and asked Sebastian if he knew a man who knew these lands well. Keiei was surprised to see an alien in front of him who could help him. She had been born in this land and decided that she would show him everything. In that case, Keiei relied on her, and the girl agreed. But Sebastian reminded the young lord that without an escort, just like that, he could not let him go. But Keiei felt that with guards, he could only draw undue attention to himself and provoke a fight. Still, Sebastian decided to send men to scout the area, and tomorrow the lad could go on his rounds. The hero said it wasn't necessary and he would just walk around the territory and do nothing. Sebastian bowed and asked the lad to at least take his grandson with him and decided to get a horse ready for them. Keiei was embarrassed and agreed. The hero warned Zen that he was leaving and that Zen would be responsible for everything in his absence, and the dog asked to rely on him. In the end, Zen and Keiei waited for the girl for another half an hour, and it was somehow too long. Eileen apologized for the wait and was ready to leave. At the sight of Eileen in her coat, the guy was embarrassed and suggested they move out in that case. Kane noticed the man who was already waiting for them near the horse. He smiled and told the stableman that he had done a great job today, and the stableman wished the young master a good day. Kane apologized for distracting him from his work and asked where Sebastian's grandson was. But to his surprise, this man named Jeff was his grandson. Jeff Hissman was 30 years old and was Sebastian's grandson. Sebastian had said earlier that his grandson was one of the youngest bodyguards in the mansion, but he looked more like a gorilla than a bodyguard. Jeff was quite muscular and perhaps more capable than the other older knights. The man thought the girl had come to escort the young lord out, but Eileen said she would ride along with him. But since that's the case, Jeff took the two surprised boys in his arms with a smile and said that they were departing. Jeff threw them immediately onto the horse and said that everything was ready. Kane along with Eileen started to get a little scared of him, for he had quite a lot of strength, but apparently no intelligence. Jeff laughed and said that he took care of the garden in the mansion, so it was hard to call him a stable boy. It turned out he was a bodyguard gardener. The man didn't understand why he needed a sword if they had no conflicts. He had plenty of free time, so he decided to take care of the garden. More importantly, Jeff was in such a state that Kane was concerned that he might have frozen something off. But Jeff asked them not to think about that, because as long as he was moving, he would definitely not freeze. He asked the boys to hold on tight to the horse so he wouldn't fall off it. The girl sat behind Kane, and he felt a nice softness and firmness near the back of his neck. Oni pressed the young lord against her and apologized to him for the fact that she very seldom rode a horse. The hero seemed to melt from her soft forms, but Eileen accidentally closed his eyes and Kane asked her to stop. The hero realized that even though he was now 10 years old, he was still a former man at heart, and this situation turned him on a lot. Even though his eyes were closed, the boy asked Eileen to take his hands away from his face because that way he couldn't see anything. The girl apologized and let the hero go, and he asked her to calm down, saying that everything was fine. Jeff laughed and the hero suggested that the girl put her hands in a different way, and she agreed. But no matter where she put her hands, he could still feel her breasts. Although if you think of it that way, from the outside, they looked like a mom and son riding a horse, and it wasn't that arousing of a mount. Along the way, they met a mysterious unkempt man who had a rather chilling look in his eyes. Kane didn't understand how he was walking around in only tattered rags, and also covered in mud, because it was really freezing outside. Every local resident here was skin and bones, and Kane thought he was wrong. This area is literally living on its last breath. The guys arrived at the ruined half-dead village, and Kane decided they'd had enough and told Jeff they were going back. The girl was surprised, for they had not yet inspected anything, but Kane apologized to her. The girl said that they hadn't even stopped by the village and were on their way back, but Kane just wanted to face the hard reality face to face. Even if they took this village as an example, the damage from the rains was more severe than he had realized, and he thought that was the case with every village in the land. He would just waste his time visiting every village, seeing the same thing before his eyes, and it was better to go back soon and start applying at least some measures to improve the situation. Alan smiled and admitted that the hero was very kind, and his actions and words would melt any woman's heart. She grabbed Kane's head and then let go, asking for forgiveness, but Kane didn't see it as a big deal, because it was very much like her. Arriving back at the mansion, all the hero could think about was that he urgently needed money, but in order to get it, he should have started with something. The mansion and the villagers had no money, so there was only one place where he could get it, and it was time to place an order. The hero asked Sebastian not to let anyone in to see him, for he would be busy drawing up documents. He also asked him to call the Zen to him, who was supposed to be in the library. When the Zen came to Kane, he ordered him to bring the code of laws. That's how he got his start in documentation and picked up the pen. There was a knock at the door and Kane allowed Aylin to enter. The girl apologized, for she knew he was busy, but she brought him tea. Kane thanked her and said he would drink it later, for he didn't have time for it now. He needed to concentrate, so he asked her not to bother him for a while. But apparently the girl wanted something else, and the hero asked what was the matter. Eileen wanted to help him with something, but the guy let her go to rest. In that case, since there was nothing she could do for him, she asked for permission to stay by his side and support Mr. Kane. The hero asked her to do anything as long as she didn't disturb him, and Aileen agreed. After a while, the hero was so tired that he fell asleep right on his desk. Aileen decided to wake up Mr. Kane and leaned over to him. Kane opened his eyes, not realizing where he was, and saw a large woman's dignity in front of him. He was so surprised that he jumped up on the spot. He was like an animal that had been wrapped in something soft, yet imbued with a pleasant fragrance and became calmer at heart. The hero disregarded the fact that he was an old man. But in her 15 years, this girl was showing a lot of maternal instinct towards him. Though he realized it was all from his childish body. This picture was certainly vicious in some ways, but it was impossible to resist it. Besides, he wasn't done with the paperwork yet, and yet Kane decided to lie on Aileen's lap for a while longer. The next night Jeff, Aileen and Kane left for the capital. This decision was made in order to reach the capital early in the morning and in addition to not attracting the attention of bandits. Sebastian objected, of course, but he was assured that they would try to leave the land so quickly that no bandit would be able to keep up with them. Jeff thought this was funny and laughed. Aileen was worried about Kane and also wanted to go with them to the capital. The hero reminded her that they were not going there for fun and the main purpose was to raise money for the lands. Therefore, he relied on Aileen. As planned early in the morning, the carriage of Jeff, Aileen and Kane arrived at the capital of the Kingdom of Rommers. The girl was surprised at the sight of the capital, but Kane didn't see it as a surprise. It was the girl's first time here in her entire life, and Jeff had been here with his father a couple times. It was quite crowded today, and the heroes assumed there was some sort of celebration going on. Aileen thought it was always like this in the capital and Kane said that there were a lot of people and money going around, so right now they would head out to apply. But Kane didn't notice as he bumped into a passerby and the man asked to watch the redneck where he was going. It was a huge, pumped-up man who thought the boy had not been taught to apologize to his elders. Kane felt like he had met some thug again and didn't know what to do. Besides, this gorilla was bigger than Jeff, but the hero didn't think he'd need extra security on his way here. He looked at Jeff and the passerby thought it was his friends. Jeff stood still and silent, and the gorilla thought he was frightened at the sight of him. Suddenly, Aileen came up to him and apologized for her little brother, for he didn't mean to make him uncomfortable. The passing man smiled evilly and admitted that his older sister was smarter than Kane. The man swallowed his drool back and said that if she kept him company for the day, he promised to turn a blind eye. The girl didn't know what to do and asked Lord Kane about it. The hero tried his best to avoid fighting, but decided that there was nothing to be done here. The hero asked Jeff to deal with him, and the man went into a rage, not realizing how the kid dared to do that. He gathered his hand into a fist and promised to teach him the manners of the capital. Jeff ended up clobbering the gorilla's arm, who screamed all over the capital. The man warned him not to touch the young gentleman, insulting Jeff in every way possible. The man demanded that he let him go, and it seemed to Jeff that he had overdone it. Alan and Kane froze in place, thinking it was cool. Jeff thought the townsfolk here were weaklings, and Kane asked why he didn't intervene right away if he realized he was stronger than he was. But Kane himself had previously ordered him not to intervene, so Jeff thought about handling it himself. The hero apologized for underestimating him and Sebastian had apparently recommended him for a reason. Jeff smiled nervously as he remembered his grandfather. To be fair, Sebastian was decently old, but Jeff still couldn't beat him. Kane was shocked and had a hard time believing it. After that, the royal knights came running in and after seeing the aftermath of the scuffle, they started questioning the heroes. Kane told them how it had all happened. Once the knights understood everything, they promised to deal with them themselves. It took the heroes some time, and Kane suggested that the others head on with their business. They had come here to make arrangements with the capital's merchants and had traveled all night to the capital for that purpose. Trading in the territory was not an option due to the high taxes, and they would only be able to fully trade in about 10 years. Alan had heard that the merchants of the capital had a keen eye and assumed that they could learn about the situation in their land. That was most likely true, but Kane had no intention of spending money on them. But here the girl had absolutely no idea what Kane was talking about. Alan was quite surprised when the guy said that they would get this money from the merchants for free. Or rather, it would be donations from the merchant guild. The girl didn't understand how this was even possible and why the trade guild would give them money. Moreover, they had nothing to do with the potions of the Carlier family. It was certainly not easy in words, but Kane asked her not to think that he came here without a clear plan. Aileen began to realize that Kane had been preparing the documents he had drafted for so long. The heroes heard shouting nearby and saw many soldiers. Kane assumed they were standard bearers and they shouted something about descent time after time. Kane thought it was a trading carriage on its way to the castle, but this was the first time Jeff had seen such a thing. Indeed, they saw 8 horses pulling a huge carriage, and it was incredible. Judging from the coat of arms, it was the Nose family, the richest family of merchants in the capital. Kane knew that usually such merchants had connections with the royal family and supplied them with luxury goods. But suddenly a thought popped into his head and before Aileen and Jeff knew it, Kane was out of sight. Suddenly they heard people screaming. The crowd was asking for someone to stop the boy who was about to be run over by a carriage. Eileen and Jeff could not believe it was the young gentleman. They froze in terror and screamed at the young gentleman, who rushed straight at the horses. The carriage went off the track and slowed down sharply. Jeff, together with the girl, shouted to the gentleman, who disappeared among the clouds of dust. Eileen couldn't believe her eyes and couldn't understand why Mr. Kane would do such a thing. No one understood what had happened or where the boy was, for there wasn't even a body left of him. People assumed that his body had flown away from the collision or that he had been left under the wheels of the carriage. Jeff asked the girl to stay put while he went and found that carriage. He suggested where the young gentleman's body might have been. He was about to take him away when suddenly someone called out to the boys. It was Mr. Kane, who was underground and trying to get out. The girl looked closely and saw the Kane's hand, and Jeff was surprised. The guy got out of the underground, noticing that he made it just in time, and the buddies shouted to the Kane. To their surprise, the hero pulled out from under the ground the black cat he had rescued. Kane thought it was quite dangerous and told the cat that he was almost left mincemeat. The protagonist was glad that he had managed to save the black cat, and now Lord Meow would owe him posthumously. The black cat hissed and was accidentally struck by Kane's lightning. The cat escaped his grasp and Kane apologized, for it was just normal alchemy and he didn't mean to hurt him. The code as if it understood everything and looked at the hero. Kane sighed heavily, for he had risked his life to save her, and concluded that the cats were rather heartless. As he watched the cats following him, the boys called out to him. Jeff tearfully ran over to the young master and lifted him into his arms. He hoped that Kane wasn't hurt and that he was okay. The hero asked Jeff to calm down and let him go, for everything was all right. The girl could not believe her eyes that Mr. Kane threw himself under the carriage just to save the cat. Jeff grabbed his head, thinking about how he didn't even have time to follow it. Kane saw the cat that was standing right in the carriage's path. Besides, he was an alchemist, and since he had been granted such power, he had to try to save someone's life. Kane noticed that Aileen was crying and didn't understand why she was doing it. The girl tried to calm down and asked Kane not to do it again. The hero promised her and Aileen was able to calm down, although mentally he realized that he couldn't promise that. He couldn't see her tears and he felt uneasy. Jeff kept apologizing to Mr. Kane for the fact that there was no way they could help him. But Kane felt that he had to apologize to them, for he had made them worry. At least Jeff was glad that everyone was okay, but Aileen's heart was still pounding. The hero offered them some respite, and taking a cup of tea in his hands, told them that this restaurant was only open to aristocrats. Kane didn't think that someone would overhear their conversation here, so if the heroes had any questions, they could ask Kane right now. Aileen recalled that he was going to ask for donations from the trade guild earlier, but she still didn't understand how they could do that and where they were going first. The hero apologized, but he should have initiated them into the details. Before they headed to the trade guild, he wanted to talk to some important people. The girl was surprised and had no idea who they might be. Kane said that they were people who would help bring the documents to the right form. They will head to the legal board to request a tax abatement tax return. The girl hesitated, and from the look of her, it seemed to Kane that she really didn't understand much. The thing is, merchants would never give them any money for nothing. But here, if legally the merchant guild makes donations to their land, that's another matter. They needed to lower the tax that the capital requested, and that's not even up for discussion. With this declaration, for the next 10 years, the taxes on their land would be reduced, giving time for development. There were a lot of things to do, negotiating with the guild and getting the declaration from the college. But the girl was worried that it would take quite a long time. Kane smirked and said that she was right, and arranging all this was not an easy task. But he had a couple ideas, and the main thing was that they were in no hurry, and so they would stay in the capital for a couple days. The next day, the protagonists arrived at the legal capital board of the Ramer's kingdom. Alan had never seen the legal board before, and asked Kane if this was really it. The hero smiled and said that this legal capital board makes many contracts every day. The hero walked up to the registration desk and introduced himself as Kane Carlier, who had an appointment. The receptionist asked to see his credentials and noticed their family crest. In that case, she asked to wait until they were invited. Jeff noticed that the place was quite spacious, but not as crowded as it might seem. Kane explained that only nobles were allowed in here and not all of them. They walked to one of the spacious rooms and Kane decided that they could wait here. The girl wanted to address the hero and Kane asked what was the matter. She wasn't sure she should have been here, and must have felt out of place when she saw the magnitude and importance of the undertaking. The hero admitted that it would have been boring here without her, and at least this way he had pleasant company. And if she weren't here, he wouldn't even have anyone to talk to. Kane glanced moodily at Jeff, who had managed to fall asleep sitting up. Kane thought he would have been able to sleep just as well if Aylin hadn't been here. Aileen smiled and reminded him that Jeff had been driving the carriage all night, and the boy thought she was right. The girl asked him to be indulgent, for Jeff had done his duty and could now rest. The hero was even afraid to imagine how Sebastian would react seeing his grandson like that. But the girl made a fearful face and told Kane that it was better for him not to know about it. The character became creepy and didn't understand why everyone had such a reaction every time he mentioned Sebastian like that. Alan was literally shaking, and she thought there were some things she'd better not mention. Suddenly, Aileen noticed something and immediately forgot about their conversation. She saw Lord Meow, who had been saved by Lord Kane earlier. The hero praised the girl for noticing him, but he stood out strongly against the white columns. For whatever reason, the black cat stared at them intently, but did not enter the room. While the girl was marveling at such a creature, the guy thought about the fact that if some bigwig saw him, he would throw him out of here. But still he couldn't understand where this touching feeling came from. The guy had a wild fantasy of a cute couple being affectionate with a kitten, and they looked pretty cute from the outside. The hero tried to remind himself that in the first place, they were here on important business, and in the second Aileen was 15 or 16 years old, and he couldn't think of such a thing. Aileen noticed that the cat had run somewhere, and she wondered where she was going. The hero assumed that she was just looking for a way out, but the girl exclaimed that he was wrong. She thought that the cat was looking for Mr. Kane to thank him for saving her, but was too shy to come any closer. The hero puffed up his cheeks and thought Aileen was talking about some other fairy tale. After that, Kane and his servants waited for a long time to be invited. Even Jeff woke up during this time. After a while, a hooded man came into their room and told Mr. Kane that they were already expected and asked him to follow him. Kane thanked and thought to himself that if he hadn't needed the money, he wouldn't have stuck around so long. The hooded man looked at Jeff and stopped him, because bodyguards are not allowed in the office. Jeff wanted to object to him, but Kane assured him that it was all right and asked him to wait here. After that, Aileen along with Kane walked behind the man who opened the doors for them and asked them to pass through. On the way to the office, Kane again noticed a black cat following him from around the corner. Earlier, the hero thought it had run off in the opposite direction to the exit and didn't understand why it was there. He assumed that he really might have taken a liking to her. Upon entering the room, the heroes saw the legal advisor of the Kingdom of Ramers in front of them. From the looks of him, it was a rather ugly, irascible, and fat man. The man asked the heir of the Carlier family, Kane, what brought them to the college building. The mere sight and energy of him made the protagonists uncomfortable. The hero would like to discuss with him the request for a tax reduction based on a donation from the trade guild according to the third paragraph of the 24th article of the commercial law. The counselor thought that it would certainly be a good idea to approve it to him. The hero noticed that this piece of fat wasn't even listening to him, and the counselor hinted to him that he was a rather busy man. Sure, he could help them, but he wanted to know what he would get in return. Kane had heard about their kingdom's corruption problem earlier, but he didn't think he'd run into it now. Though not much, but they prepared them a payment for his wasted time, and Kane asked the girl to take the coins to the counselor. The counselor said that was fine, and the girl went over to him. The man remarked that although Lord Kane was quite young, he knew perfectly well how things worked, and that was commendable. The counselor accepted the pouch and said that this small sum was enough to have fun with his colleagues, but it was not enough to gather a working group for even 3 days. The hero was angry, for he had given him 100,000 pounds, and the bloody greedy pig was not enough. But Kane tried to restrain himself as best he could. The man tried to explain that he and his colleagues went to the highest class establishments, but perhaps one of his not so experienced and professional colleagues would agree to help them out. He realized that they didn't have much money, but this small donation wouldn't satisfy anyone. But to make everyone happy, the fatty would like to ask for one more thing. After these words, Kane tried even harder to remain calm. Aileen got a shiver when the man asked to lend them a girl for just a couple nights. Kane couldn't see any equal exchange here, and for this pig to play with her like some kind of toy. Kane was furious and couldn't understand how this fatty could even think of such a thing. The hero thought that cutting him into pieces would not be enough and he should have been let to feed the fish. Of course, Kane would very much like to do this, but he was not going to disrupt the negotiations, much less agree to his terms. He approached Mr. Counselor with an innocent face and asked him to understand. The fat counselor thought about how Lord Kane was going to deny him such a small request. Kane asked to understand that she was his trusted person who knew a lot about their family, so he couldn't do that. But the counselor doubted that she was only a trusted person and smirked. The counselor couldn't believe that such a young girl was allowed to do such a difficult job. Plus, he was aware of the condition of their lands. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted by Aileen. She had made up her mind and told Mr. Kane and the counselor that she agreed to his terms. The girl thought that Mr. Kane was the only one who could save their lands, and if by such a small sacrifice she could help them, she would be glad. The counselor was delighted and said that it wasn't for nothing that she worked for Lord Kane, and she was pretty quick to grasp things on the fly. In that case, he offered to discuss all their abilities in his mansion, for example, and asked the girl to come closer to him. The disgusting man exhaled air like vapor and each time asked her to come even closer. But Kane decided he'd had enough, and not only did the bastard dare to look down on the Carlier family, but he was making an attempt on Aileen. Kane tolerated it for a long time, but he could not allow the girl to be touched with a finger. But suddenly he was overtaken by someone and shouting was heard outside the door of the room. A voice commanded the swineherd to stand still and not to dare to commit lawlessness within the walls of the legal college. The counselor was frightened and apparently knew who was behind those doors. There was an explosion and Kane fell nose first into the ground, while Aileen screamed and covered her ears with her hands. The mysterious figure in the hat decided that the counselor was unlucky, but it was clearly a lucky day for the boy. The fat counselor was covered in cold sweat, not understanding what she was doing here. It was the court enchantress Marin Roof, who was 27 years old. But a friend had whispered to her what kind of mischief he was doing to these children, and she could not pass them by. The girl insulted the counselor and said that he was the head of the college and was going to strip the children to nothing, who had come to him because they had no money. But the counselor thought that their college would not have lasted on the pennies they were getting, and he was just getting donations for doing a good job. But the girl did not want to hear this and ordered him to be quiet. She also reminded him that he had almost forced the girl to fulfill his vulgar fantasies. The girl asked not to think that the kingdom would allow him to do such a rampage. Marin threatened the counselor that the scourge would await him for this. According to the advisor, Lady Marin was a court sorceress and magic instructor in a special unit, but he believed that did not give her the right to interfere with his work. The girl smirked. She thought it was funny how he chortled. The counselor felt that he was not obliged to listen to her, and the only one he obeyed was Mr. Richard, that he could contact the Minister of Labor. Little did the girl know that the Minister of Labor was far more frightening than the princess. Kane was surprised by this situation and noticed that the swineherd had turned pale. Alan assumed that Kane knew this girl. She was from a family of hereditary enchanters that served the crown, and she was quite famous among all the nobles. Apparently, the counselor didn't even know that she was related to the princess, and didn't understand what he was in for. The enchantress said that if he didn't fall to his knees, rear his fat ass and beg for forgiveness, he couldn't even hope for an easy death. The counselor interrogated her and Marin thought he was deaf. She said that Princess Octavia, whom she served, hated vice and corruption more than anything else, and freaks like him really pissed her off. Marin invited him to imagine what would await him if the princess heard what he had done. A gloating smirk appeared on her face. The counselor fell at her feet and begged for forgiveness, promising that he would not do it again. He asked for pity on him and the girl found it amusing. She stepped on his face, thinking she had heard what she heard. Piggy grunted and asked her for some sort of pardon, but the girl suggested remembering how many innocents he had already ripped off. She stepped on his face even harder and the counselor swore he would never do it again. Marin looked smugly at the counselor and asked how he would behave from now on. The counselor was willing to do whatever she said, and the girl became furious. Marin asked him not to hope that he could redeem himself with a simple apology and called out a Noir. Apparently, Noir was the black cat that had walked past the surprised Kane and meowed at him. The black cat came up to the greaser's face and let out its huge claws. The cat scratched all over his face and the counselor begged for it to stop. The girl noticed and told the cute Noir that he still had areas on his face that were not scratched and it was not okay. At the counselor's shouting, the guards came running and trying to figure out what was going on here, and Marin said that the Noir had just caught the corruptor red-handed. She suggested that the guards watch their sentence being carried out. Apparently, the guards trusted Ms. Marin and were confident that he was definitely a criminal if she said so. Kane was surprised that they didn't even make any complaints, and Aileen assumed that she was quite popular. Marin then asked the guards to bring her paper and pen and the guards immediately did her bidding. The girl took the piece of paper and everything became clear to her. She signed the paper right on the back of the half-dead counselor and said that only the signature of that pig-headed man was left. But she noticed that he was all done and asked the guards to carry him away. The girl left further care of him to the guards and he was carried away. Marin with the cat on her hat greeted the baby Kane and it could be assumed that this was their thanks from the Noir. As her mistress, she had simply done her bidding, and Kane was surprised that she had accidentally saved the life of Mistress Marin's friend. The girl handed Kane the document and hoped that with it she could repay him for saving Noir. Kane couldn't believe his eyes. He never thought he could get the contract so easily. Kane realized that he should have saved face since they were aristocrats after all. He bowed and thanked Ruth-sama. Even though it was their first meeting, he asked permission to introduce himself to her, and the girl asked him to drop the formalities. She already knew that the guy was the eldest son of the Carlier family, Kane, who had saved her friend from the wheels of the Nose family's carriage. She didn't need to know more than that. Kane was still kind of awkward, and the girl marveled that he was just a boy, but so diligent. Marin felt that even if she just saved this girl along with the document, she was still indebted to him. But the enchantress assumed that he wanted to save her himself, and Kane was embarrassed. The boy grinned and thought that apparently there was definitely nothing to hide from her eyes, and that was that. Marin winked and said she would find out whatever she needed to know. She handed the guy the document, and the hero thanked her. The hero had already realized that Noir was a black cat who was a friend of the enchantress, but the girl replied that Noir was a modest woman, and since he saved her life, she was very grateful to him, but was shy to even approach him to personally thank him, so she followed him. Kane was shocked that Aileen ended up being right. This was the first time Marin had seen Noir in this light, and apparently he really took a liking to her. The hero was embarrassed and admitted that he was glad to hear that. And since that was the case, the enchantress suggested he go out with her. Kane was confused and admitted that he was too young for that, and the enchantress laughed. She told little Kane that he was still too serious and it was just a joke. The girl noticed that it was now quite late and suggested that they have dinner sometime when they had time. Kane couldn't refuse and happily agreed. About the counselor, she asked him not to worry and he would be punished for everything he had done. Besides, Marin would personally see to it, and since she still hadn't repaid him for saving her little girl, if he had any problems, he could resort to them at the palace. In parting, Marin promised to help him in any way she could, after which she disappeared. It seemed to Kane that she walked through the place like a hurricane and left. It was over much faster than he had planned, and now they could leave for their next destination. Alan was thrilled that Kane could like such an incredible girl, and she had expected nothing less from Mr. Kane. Kane, as usual, was embarrassed with her praise. The main characters had to wake up Jeff and go to the trade guild. There they were met by Randolph, who was delighted at the unexpected meeting with Lord Kane. Randolph didn't understand why they hadn't written him a letter that they were going to come, for he could have at least allocated them a chaperone. Kane greeted Randolph and said that he had come to them today with an interesting proposition. The man grinned and admitted that the guy knew how to intrigue. Kane was sure they would be satisfied. Randolph had treated Kane like a child earlier, but now felt he had come for a reason. As expected from one of the best merchants in the capital, albeit belatedly, Randolph wanted to congratulate Kane on his new position, and Kane thanked him. He also expressed his gratitude on behalf of all the previously bachelor merchants, whom they had managed to introduce to beautiful women. Though a little, Randolph hoped that their gifts would make him happy. As expected of Randolph, he had prepared in advance for Kane's coming here, and Kane thanked him for all those gifts. Kane reminded Randolph that they were both busy people, so he would not brood and get right to the point. At the moment, the Carlier territory needed money, and they wanted donations from the Trade Guild. Randolph was sorry to say this to Lord Kane, but his suggestion sounded too frivolous. According to his sources, the annual tribute and crops for the next 10 years were taken as collateral by the merchants in the territory, and it would be unwise for the guild to sponsor them. But apparently Randolph misunderstood him, and Kane did not come here to cooperate, but to take money from them. Randolph told the fellow that however good friends they were with him, he was first and foremost a merchant, and merchants don't just give money to anyone. But no one told them that they were giving their money for nothing, and Kane asked Aileen for a piece of paper. The girl handed the signed paper to Randolph, and the merchant read it. It was a treaty to reduce taxes, and it was signed not only by the counselor, but also by the court wizard. The hero would want the Randolph to give the money from the taxes they pay the capital to him to help the needy. It seemed to Kane that this was a pretty good deal. It would indeed be wise to use the money that the corrupt officials were squirreling away and give it to those in need, but it was an exorbitant amount even for a donation. Randolph asked to give them one night while he discussed it all with his colleagues, and they would give them an answer tomorrow. Kane relied on Randolph and agreed with him. Kane was about to leave, and Aileen followed him, but Randolph asked Lord Kane to stay at least for a cup of tea. But Kane refused, for time was more precious than money. Kane thanked his friend for his time, and said he would wait to hear from him. Kane was about to leave the trade guild on foot when he was met by a merchant's carriage with all his gifts, so he decided to return on it. Alan wasn't sure if they would be able to get any money from the guild, but Kane asked her not to worry about that. Randolph is obligated to pay them out of the tax reduction treaty, and he'll already be better off if he agrees to it. In the end, the hero felt like Jeff, and he was very tired. In that case, the girl wanted to offer something to Kane and slammed herself on her knees. The hero could rest on her lap, and if he was very tired, and the girl would be happy about it. The hero lay down on the girl's lap and apologized for taking advantage of it, but Aileen was overjoyed. As a result, the unpleasant motion sickness from the ride no longer bothered his ears so much. The next day came, and Aileen wished Mr. Kane a good morning. She noticed that he looked a little tired, but the hero replied that he was fine. The hero decided to set a goal and planned to pay off their debt within 3 years. Otherwise, if he slowed down, the Carlier family would be swallowed up not only by the debt, but also by a bunch of extra interests. But today they were to receive good news from the Chamber of Commerce, and the girl could see the confidence in Kane's eyes. The lad explained that confidence was born of actions, and Aileen expected that from Mr. Kane. But she wished the lad would take away the fatigue of it all. She thought he should eat more, for if he ate more, he would surely grow taller. But it seemed to Kane that growth did not depend on the amount of food he ate. But when Kane leaves adulthood, and if he is still short, it will be a big problem. Alan was apparently worried about his future, but Kane didn't understand why she cared. But he could agree that short women weren't exactly favored by women. The hero eventually agreed that he would eat more and then he would be taller than his grandfather. The girl didn't understand where he was in a hurry, but Kane asked her to be quiet and promised that he would eat everything. Alan warned him that if he did not chew his food properly, he would surely choke on it. The girl noticed that Kane was also soiled and pulled her hand with a handkerchief to his face. As she wiped his mouth, Kane became embarrassed and his cheeks reddened. She looked at the Lord's appearance and asked permission to help clean him up once he had eaten. As the girl brushed the lad's hair, she noticed that he was tired after all, and Kane could not deny it. The girl asked Mr. Kane not to fidget, but the lad couldn't help it, for he had no room to breathe under Aileen's lush bust. Still, he realized that the body of a 15-16-year-old beauty was awakening a 30-year-old monster in his body. The girl still combed his hair and warned him that she could accidentally hurt him that way. After eating, Kane felt like sleeping. The girl was sure that after an afternoon nap, something good would happen. The boy thought she was right and lay down on Aileen's lap. A couple hours passed and Aileen's words were confirmed. Randolph delivered a large donation to them, just as Kane had suggested. He even personally delivered the entire amount to them at the estate. As Mr. Kane had said earlier, this money would help the people of their villages, and so far everything was going according to plan. As he had said, all this did not happen from mere self-confidence, but all that happened was a logical outcome of events. But Aileen didn't quite understand what Mr. Kane was talking about. They got that money because he had planned this plan and started even before they came with the documents to the capital. Randolph planned to be the next head of the trade guild, and his opponent was a veteran merchant that had been running the guild for 30 years. It wouldn't be easy for Randolph to get the position, and Kane thought how he could change that. And the guy thus enabled Randolph to become a hero who would donate the guild's money for the benefit of the poor villagers. Now the merchant will be celebrated as the hero who saved the lands of the Carlier family, and rumors of this will quickly reach the capital. In addition, Grace and the other maids he has married to powerful men in the capital will help them spread this rumor among the merchants. He has already asked Jeff to meet with them and spread the word. In other words, Grace and the other girls had decided to leave home in order to save the lands of the Carlier family. But Kane told Aileen that this was not the case. They were worried about their carefree existence, and he would provide it for them. In gratitude for that, they would do him this favor. Kane purposely placed the family crest of the Randolph family of Derman in a prominent place on the Carlier's carriage, delivering donations to them. In this way, the whole kingdom knew and praised Randolph's good-naturedness. Randolph recognized that the young gentleman was quite an interesting personality, and he could no longer see him as a child. After all, he had just fulfilled the terms of the contract, but now he was also left owing. And since Mr. Kane had become so serious, it was in his power to make him a merchant who would control the entire economy in the kingdom of Rommers. Today, a carriage arrived again from the capital with warm clothes and food for the villagers, and so they helped the villagers survive this winter. And this was just the first step toward their future. Kane noticed Alan holding an object in her hand and asked what it was. The girl smiled and said that it was a gift from her younger sister. Earlier, she had found a beautiful pebble and gave it to Aileen. The girl gave it to her sister and said that this pebble was as beautiful as she was. But this was the first time the hero heard that Aileen had a younger sister. The girl did not tell him that she had been gone during the famine 5 years before, but now Mr. Kane was here. Afterward, Kane returned to his study and leaned his head on his desk. He felt sad that he had not been here 5 years ago and had not been able to save Sister Aileen. But there was no point in thinking about what he could have done and needed to think about the present. Suddenly, the same moth that had asked for his forgiveness appeared before his eyes again. She wanted to remind him that she was the mother of the earth goddess named Opraya. The lad remarked that she was quite comfortable and had not climbed out once during the time he had been in the capital. But the girl replied that he had not called on her either and called him a little profane. Besides, she thought that if he had this attitude toward her, then in all likelihood these lands were further and further away from God. Yet she was the mother goddess of these lands and could not leave her for nothing. She asked to consider the hero as if she were his bride who was waiting for his return. Opraya reminded Keiei that his stats could suddenly drop for such an attitude. The hero immediately changed his shoes and apologized to her for daring to behave so disrespectfully towards her. He asked his mother earth goddess to be lenient to him and forgive him. The girl didn't understand why it was always so difficult with him, and the boy hoped she had come to him to please him with good news. Opraya sighed heavily and reminded him that she could come for nothing. The hero asked her to stop pretending and show him his screen of the kingdom. Keiei was quite surprised that for whatever reason he had a large influx of new residents. The thing was that the capital city found out that these lands were sponsored for free, so many people decided to move here. Personal reputation and health care had increased and they definitely wouldn't die of starvation. But the rest of the stats were questionable. The girl suggested to Keiei to think for a while. Agriculture, trade, and businesses have fallen due to flooding and the arrival of winter. By spring, it will be necessary to get to grips with the restoration of trade and agriculture. That was easy to say, except that their kingdom's debt had not diminished. And the goddess also reminded that interest would gradually accrue. But the girl asked little Keiei not to give up, for Opraya would always support him. But the hero would like her to cancel his debts if she was so eager to help. But the girl apologized and said that it was out of her power. And so the winter passed, which Keiei had originally feared he would not survive. He had even turned 11 years old, but the size of his debt had not diminished. In Japanese yen, the debt was 500 billion. And as the new year dawned, Keiei was overcome with anxiety. He was thinking about what he should have done first, when suddenly he was called by a Zen. The Zen wanted to report that they had received a request from the Jin village to resolve their conflict. Apparently this was not the first time and the hero did not want to do it again. Keiei didn't realize how much their conflict could be resolved and assumed that the village didn't have a headman. He was right, but the villagers wished for Keiei to reason with them. The hero was tired of them asking him for it forever, and as a thank you, they would give away one of the village's beauties. The hero was tired of all this, and asked Zen to bring Sebastian here. Sebastian bowed and entered the young master's office. Keiei told him that the documents said that his grandfather had lent the villagers a debt, and asked if it was possible to collect it from them now. Sebastian hesitated, and Keiei asked him to answer as is. The butler thought it was impossible now. In that case, the hero decided that now would be a good time to enter the new year by eliminating all those silly debts. He asked Sebastian to gather the maids and the butler obeyed the order. Keiei ordered taxes to be collected from some of the wealthier residents of the territory and used them to buy a lot of groceries, alcohol, and a bunch of cattle carcasses. The maids did not understand what Keiei intended to accomplish by making them cut up this meat. Aileen replied that they would have a celebration, but that was not what the maids were talking about. Linda thought it was very, very little. She didn't understand how this 10 cows would feed thousands of people for the festivities, especially since their people were all farmers and they would eat it up quickly. Linda assumed that Aileen was close to Mr. Keiei and probably knew some gossip. The girl asked to keep the knife away from her and admitted that he had told her nothing of the sort. Scarlett was stern as usual and, quickly slicing the meat, ordered Linda to shut up and work. The girls were shocked at her speed of work and Scarlett said that if they didn't hurry up, they wouldn't make it in time for the feast. One of the maids said that they really still had a lot of work to do. A girl named Catherine asked the girls if they knew that the Lord had lent to neighboring villages. She was shocked that everyone knew about it and apparently she was the only one who was unaware. Scarlett asked her to take her knife and go to work. Catherine wanted to borrow from the Lord, but one of the maids said she was stupid. People were going to this because even their own land could not feed them. Then it turns out those farmers in the garden were losers who never paid them back. A girl named Gertrude put her arms around Linda's neck and said that there was a limit to rude behavior. Linda asked for her pardon and took it back, but Gertrude was ready to strangle her. It turns out that the gentleman had bought meat from those he had lent to and was going to feed them that same meat. The girls wondered more and more what the young lord was up to. Keiei noticed that they were acting rather cautiously, but he didn't think that debtors who couldn't even pay back their debts would have come to this feast. Aileen told Mr. Keiei that all the preparations were finished and Keiei praised them for their good work. In that case, they could begin, and Kane suggested that the girl act on their plan. The guy greeted the gentleman and thanked everyone for coming today. He introduced himself as the interim Lord Kane Carlier, and since they had come here, they would be treated to a delicious meal and alcohol completely free of charge. The men were shocked that they could eat all that, and they had never eaten such food in their lives. One of the men recalled that he had never been able to pay the Lord's debt and was upset. But that was not all, for the beautiful maids would gladly serve each of them. The girls appeared in beautiful dresses and outfits and poured alcohol for everyone who wanted it. Scarlet asked them not to be shy and to approach, and one of the men thought they gave off a nice scent. To all the men, they were real cuties and felt like they were in paradise. After the guests were served by the beauties, Kane moved on to the main topic of the meeting. He decided to interview everyone who could pay him a debt. One of the men asked him to understand and said that he could only pay the interest, because he had to feed his family of 8. Kane praised the man for trying to pay the interest even though he had a large family. To Kane, he was a real good boy, and the hero noticed that the guy was very thin, so he asked him to eat more meat. He also offered to take it for his family, which the man was shocked by. The guy called for the next one, and as soon as the villager told him that due to the recent flood most of the cattle had died, he threw away his case. Besides, they had some food left. The next man, however, had a broken mill, so they could not work. The flow of the river changed, and it had a detrimental effect on all of them. Kane also threw that business away and called the next man. So Kane listened to each guest and divided into 2 groups. Those who could pay the interest would be given new due dates, and those who were found incapable of paying their debts. Their own debt receipts were placed in a large bowl in the center. Zen was surprised at the number of them, and they seemed to reach as high as the sky. Eileen didn't understand what Mr. Kane intended to do with these debt receipts, but to Kane, it seemed obvious and he wanted to burn them. Aileen and Zen fell into a stupor, not believing their ears. But as they heard him, Kane ordered them all to be burned and was obviously pleased with it. The hero asked Sebastian, and the butler lit a large torch. The people could not believe that the debentures had been burned before their eyes. They didn't understand what was even happening and assumed it was all a dream. And now Kane asked to hear his friends out and said that the former lord of these lands, his grandfather Leopold Carlier, had loaned them the money as donations to those affected by natural disasters. But now the interest was being collected for the defense of their lands, and all that money would go to soldiers and uniforms. And as the current lord of these lands, as of today, the lad will release those who are unable to pay his family's debt. The men could not believe that their debts were cancelled. One of the men cried at the thought of not having to sell his daughter and cow. No one could believe it, as if it was a dream. And the men decided that God had heard their prayers. They decided that Lord Kane had had a new lord sent down to them by God himself. Zen decided to make sure the young lord was sure of his decision, for he had burned receipts for 10 million pounds. The hero asked him to listen and told him that their family was already in huge debt, and a couple million wouldn't do them any good. Their land was already in decline, and if these people had a huge debt with interest on it, they would be more likely to run away without paying anything. The territory of the Carlier family needed people, and people who would help them get back on their feet and get rich, and in the future pay their taxes faithfully. But Zen reminded that he gathered not only those who owed them, but also those who could pay them interest. But there was a reason for that too. He needed to gather the people in one place. When it comes to money, people hate to be left out of the loop. If Kane had forgiven the debt secretly to those who couldn't do anything about it, the result would have been conflicts later on. And in this way, not only did he please everyone by making a statement on behalf of the Lord, but he fed them by letting their guard down and allowing them to honestly admit their financial situation. As a result, Kane checked all the debtors, weeded out those who had money and those who did not. He increased his credibility and dealt with a lot of worthless debts. One could say that his act was a contribution to the future, for those whom he had relieved of debt now owed him a debt for life. As soon as Zen realized this, his eyes lit up. Zen was impressed with the young lord and said it was just a great plan, all thanks to the fact that he had once read the biography of Meng Yaojun. Just like Aileen said earlier, Lord Kane was just a wonderful person. Linda noticed that every time Aileen talked about the Lord, she looked more and more like a girl in love. Aileen blushed and Scarlett asked her to ignore Linda's caustic comments. After what happened, she thought they should reconsider their attitude towards the current Lord. The farmers owed their lord enough money, but he showed tolerance to them, forgetting about such a huge debt, and showed himself as a trustworthy man. They had simply underestimated Mr. Kane all along. That was why the girl hoped that Aileen was not intent on appropriating a man of such a broad mind for herself alone. And since that was the case, Scarlett wished that Aileen would take them all to Mr. Kane right now. Meanwhile, Mr. Kane rejoiced in the long-awaited peace and quiet. Besides, there was no buzzing hallucination under his ear nearby. But immediately the goddess appeared before him and reminded him that she was not any hallucination. She was his sweet beloved, the goddess mother of the earth Oprea. But the hero asked her to remind him when she had time to become his beloved. But the girl asked him not to be embarrassed, for she guessed his feelings for her, but the lad said he was not embarrassed at all. The guy coldly asked her to finally show her their situation. Opera noticed that he was still just as unromantic and opened the statistics of the kingdom. She asked to see how his personal reputation and the faith of the people had risen. Observing his actions, Opera was confident that his popularity would increase year after year. This was all fine, of course, but the hero did not understand why healthcare had suddenly fallen. But it wasn't really about him, it was just that the bandits in the West had become active again, and they had stepped up their raids since the beginning of the year. The hero also wanted to look at the current debt, and the girl decided to make sure he was sure of it. They ended up with another £43 million accrued, and Kane didn't understand why it was so much. In the end, he couldn't trace the correlation and whether there was any reduction in the debt. He was only shown the final total. In that case, the hero suggested that she disappear, and the girl promised to leave soon. But before she left, she wished to reward him for his hard work. Opera flew up to the guy and kissed him on the cheek and then dissolved, saying that this was her reward. At the same time, Aileen knocked on the door and asked permission to enter. She hoped that Mr. Kane was not busy, and the guy allowed her in. Along with her were a bunch of maids who apologized for the intrusion. Aileen said that all the girls were touched by his act and came to personally show their gratitude to him. The hero could understand them and assumed that they were all close friends of Aileen. He believed that everything that had happened was the result of hard work by each of them and praised them for their good work today. Scarlet bowed and asked him not to say that, for their labor paled in comparison to his accomplishment. They were the maids of the Carlier family and wanted to do their best in relieving Kane of unnecessary burdens in life. The hero was pleased with Scarlet's eagerness and noticed that she was quite a perky girl. Meanwhile, Scarlet was surprised that Mr. Kane knew his name. But it was obvious, for they are all like family in this mansion. He knew that Catherine had beautiful, curly golden curls. Gertrude had silky long black hair. Frances had short brown hair. And little Jamie had the brightest blue eyes. Linda was at a loss for words, and Aileen was shocked that despite how busy he is, Kane was able to memorize each of them. And even Linda, who for some reason everyone always forgets. Aileen cheered Linda up and told her that Mr. Kane remembered her. But the girl told the young lord that it was a rather cruel description. In any case, the feast went well, and it was all due to their hard work. And if they desired some kind of reward, they could have asked for it. But the hero reminded them that, unfortunately, he could not give them money for the time being, because of their economic crisis in their territory. Scarlet decided to voice her rather bold request and asked for permission to make it. Aileen became anxious, but Kane reassured her by saying that it was okay and he would listen to any of their requests. And since Mr. Kane allowed her, Scarlet asked for a hug as a reward. The hero, of course, could not refuse her, and the girl apologized and hugged the lord. Her soft and firm bust fell right on his face. Linda blushed and told Scarlet that it wasn't fair, but it looked quite interesting. All the other maids wanted to do that too. Alan asked the girls to stop and in that case decided that she would do it too. The maids started to crowd in and Mr. Kane asked them to come up one by one. It was certainly quite a strange sight for him. The girls were delighted at how nice Mr. Kane was. He was not only nice, but he was also a trustworthy man. Still, the girls didn't expect Scarlet to ask for such a thing. And apparently this guy had captivated Scarlet's heart. Still, Aileen thought it was rude to attack Mr. Kane like that, but the others thought that someone other than her should also enjoy his company. Besides, she had no right to take him away from the others. Suddenly, a butler appeared in the corridor and Scarlet ordered everyone to immediately line up. The butler asked Aileen what they were doing in the young master's study, and the girl explained that they wanted to thank him for today's deed and nothing more. In that case, Sebastian asked them not to make any noise in the hallway and the girls obeyed him. Half a month had passed since the debt cancellation feast. In order to get the territories in shape, it was necessary to find the root of the problem. And for that, it was worth studying the entire history of the land. Still, Zen was not doing a good job in the library and Kane decided to find him an assistant. There was a knock on his office and Kane asked to come in. Sebastian opened the door and apologized for disturbing him, and Kane assumed he had something urgent. Unfortunately it was, and there had been an increase in bandit activity in the western lands of Gulai, so the general asked for their resupply of troops. Kane remembered that up until now, his great-uncle had been in charge of external decisions. But now that he stood at the head of these lands, it was up to him to handle military conflicts. And if you recall, half a month ago, Opera had mentioned these bandits. They had intensified their raids since the beginning of the year, and if they did nothing, healthcare would drop to zero. The total number of soldiers in the lands is about 4,000, and they are all spread out across the lands. But there are 2,000 in the central lands. The hero asked Sebastian if they had enough 300 soldiers to support the front, and it was more than enough. In that case, Keiei gave him the paper and asked him to send supplies and 300 soldiers to the west. To be honest, he wouldn't want to hire new soldiers, for he didn't have any money as it was. But if the situation worsened, not only the people would suffer, but also the land here. Looking at this list, it seemed that there were many capable soldiers who had served under his grandfather, but now most of them were simply incapacitated because of their age. And the other part had resigned after the lands passed to Keiei's father. The hero was very angry with him, for he had managed to spoil his whole life. He could, of course, ask Sebastian to get involved as well, and this is the one moment where he was just missing some special cheater skill. At this point, the hero didn't understand why he needed pretty maids when he could have been given capable feudal lords and warlords. The shortage of capable men was another problem that needed to be solved as soon as possible. As soon as the hero is done with the paperwork, he decided to make an appointment with his great uncle. And before he came back, it was possible to step away for a mini break. Shouts were heard from the street that a messenger had arrived. Keiei began to make a quick dash down the stairs, wondering what all the commotion was about. Once downstairs, Keiei saw Aileen and asked what was going on with them. Zen tried to help the injured messenger and asked the young lord to get out of here now. Keiei was confused, not understanding what was going on here. The wounded messenger replied that 10,000 soldiers were coming here right now. The hero assumed it was a soldier from the west, and he had terrible wounds. He asked the servants to help him now. The messenger replied that the Goliath was coming for the young lord. The Goliath was a powerful warrior from the western village who was loyal to his lord. Sebastian did not understand why suddenly such a man, who paid his taxes faithfully, went against the government and descended into banditry. After a while, the Goliath reached the lord's mansion and ordered him to show himself. He threatened that he would personally skin him. This was a huge, pumped-up man Goliath who was 42 years old and was the head of the western village. But if that was all there was to it, Keiei guessed what this was all about and thought it would be easy enough to talk to him. Jeff asked permission to accompany the young master, but Keiei said he had no use for him. He also asked the girls to calm down and just believe in him. Keiei asked Zen to bring him a chair. The girls and Jeff didn't know what to do, but Sebastian decided that they just had to believe in the young master. However, Goliath's act was very strange indeed. The hero went out to meet the head and verified that he was the Goliath. Keiei was about to listen to him attentively, but the Goliath did not realize what a minnow was standing opposite him. The lad replied that he was the son of the lord of these lands, Keiei Carlier. He is currently the lord in temporary charge and his butler had told him about him. Goliath was shocked that he was the grandson of Lord Leopold, but their kinship could not appease his anger. To begin with, Keiei would have wanted him to calm down, for he did not understand why such a respectable man was behaving like a barbarian. Apparently Keiei was unaware of what the nobles and officials had done to them, but Keiei apologized and explained that he had just recently been made a lord, and Keiei was well aware that Goliath would not go against the Carlier family without a good reason, so the lad would like to hear from the Goliath what they had done. To them, the former lord was comparable to a god. But ever since he left this world and Keiei's father took his place, things have gone wrong. Greedy officials had broken the taboo. They desecrated the priestess of the Temple of the Earth Mother, the temple of a goddess worshipped long before the land belonged to the Carlier family. And if Mr. Leopold were alive, Goliath would give him the right to decide things his own way. But no way for this autocrat in the role of lord. It was now clear to Keiei what had happened and their reasons. Goliath was determined to get rid of every corrupt official who dared to defame a sacred place by presenting their heads to the goddess. And if that was the case, then they truly deserved punishment from his acts. And the hero thought that Goliath should have been rewarded for such a thing. Keiei said that unfortunately his father was ill and had no idea what was going on in these lands, and he had sent his son in his place. Now Keiei was determined to change these lands, and he would take this opportunity to guarantee them that he would come with a personal inspection to every corner of the land and punish every official himself, removing them from their places of power. But it also pleased Keiei that the first step toward the purification of these lands was taken by them. Keiei praised Goliath for a job well done and asked him to accept his father's, and his grandfather's thanks. Goliath was so shocked that he let the sword out of his hand. The hero wanted to apologize for all the pain his father had caused with his stewardship, but he was now the lord of these lands, and he wanted to promise that by the end of the year, all officials would be punished and the people would finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the Goliath realized that the guy could say anything on pain of death and didn't know how to believe him. Then the hero decided to prove the honesty of his intentions and asked Zen to fetch the thing from the warehouse. Goliath was shocked when he saw all the wealth of the Karge family that had been provided to him by Keiei. The hero was in agreement that it was more like shiny junk, and he originally wanted to sell the pile to the merchants. They valued the junk at a couple tens of millions, which surprised the Goliath. The people decided to make sure that they would buy it all for more money, and so the guy wanted the Goliath to go to the capital with the merchants and the junk and come back with the money. Goliath suggested that he might steal that money, but Keiei didn't care. After all, he was sure that Goliath would spend it to help the people of the land, so whether he gave it away or not, it would still end up going to those in need, and Keiei just wanted to borrow his power. Goliath didn't understand what this little thing was doing more like a girl, and his actions no doubt said that he had the blood of Mr. Leopold running through him. Goliath ordered the Gurai's brother to approach him and asked if they could trust the new lord. But the Gurai thought they could, for the lads had no doubts about his words either. In that case, Goliath shook hands with Keiei and the lads said he relied on them. Goliath shouted to the people that they had heard everything and their new goal was to escort the traders to the capital, knock off a bunch of money, and return to their land. The maids were terrified, not realizing who these ambles were or what was going on. What puzzled Aileen even more was that they were laughing. Sebastian had no doubt that the young master could handle them, and Jeff was moved to tears by the hero's courage. He thought their young master was simply inimitable. Scarlet decided they had a long way to go to become his worthy maids, and Aileen decided she was right. Lord Keiei was truly an amazing boy. And so in what seemed like only a couple hours, Goliath's army brought the money back to the Carlier family mansion. Keiei praised the Goliath for a fine job and wished he could ask him about the situation in the lands as they returned. But things were just awful, especially in the areas where the bandits had become active and the guy was clear. He said there was only one thing left for them to do, but the Goliath didn't know what he meant. The thing is that now their land could be compared to a cauldron of hell and sinners are constantly trying to get out of it. But against the fight against them, they did not have many capable warriors. Keiei had heard that Goliath had been loyal to the Carlier family for years, paying taxes to his grandfather. But because of their family's actions, they had lost their trust and Keiei regretted it. Keiei knew how much he cared about this land and the people who lived here, so on behalf of the Carlier family, he decided to give him all this gold. Keiei asked him to use the money to buy supplies and lead a large army that would be able to rid their land of bandits. Goliath was shocked that Mr. Keiei would trust him with such a thing. Keiei thought he was against it, but it was the opposite and Goliath was grateful to him. He just couldn't refuse something like this, and they would be able to do a lot with this money. Tears of joy flowed from the stern man's eyes. Not only will they be able to destroy these thugs, but they will be able to provide food and shelter for all the needy people of this land. Keiei thought that he would dispose of this money in a dignified manner and asked the general to get to his feet. Keiei ordered Goliath and his friends to bring him all their weapons, but they were more like scrap metal. Taking one of the swords in his hand, Keiei was convinced that it was impossible to defeat anyone with such a weapon, and these blades would serve as material for a new mold. The soldiers didn't understand what he was going to do with them, but Goliath ordered them all to be silent and watch carefully. The hero used his alchemy magic and applied attribute earth magic on the swords. Guy used steel revival and Goliath became convinced of Lord Carlier's true power. This youngster by his own strength brought dozens of guns back to their original form in a few seconds and weakened greatly. Randolph was moved to tears by this and lifted the young lord off the ground, who promised to reward them. The man thought this was too generous on the part of the lord. The men were delighted with their new weapons and felt that following Lord Keiei was the right thing to do. The hero apologized to the Goliath and asked him to take it back to Sebastian, but by all appearances he may not have even said that. Sebastian, Jeff, and Aileen were worried about the young lord, but Randolph explained that he was just exhausted. Sebastian asked Aileen and Jeff to escort the young master to his chambers. Sebastian greeted the Goliath, and the man said he should have come to them earlier, but it made no difference now. On this day, Keiei Carlier, only 11 years old by the power of alchemy and the knowledge of past and present lives, was able to raise an army of 10,000 men. But the real battle awaited Keiei ahead. All the maids surrounded the bed of Keiei, who was sleeping on Aileen's lap, and the girl asked everyone to keep quiet. It seemed unfair to Linda that again only Aileen was taking care of him. The garden of the Carlier family mansion became a haven for 10,000 Goliath soldiers. Every year it was supplied with more and more supplies. The garden was quite lively now, but Zen saw nothing surprising in it, for everyone had heard about Keiei's incredible alchemical abilities. But it actually worked out, because the weapon already had a shape, and getting it back to its original form wasn't that hard. Zen noticed that the guy was being modest again, and he thought that Keiei was showing them hospitality, and even feeding them. It was said in ancient China that one who fed the hungry became a hero, and the effect was amazing. But Keiei decided to just go along with Zen. Sebastian approached the young master and asked him for a moment of his time. Keiei saw no problem with that and offered to talk in his office. Apparently he wanted to talk to him for a reason, and Sebastian wanted to know if Keiei was going back to the capital. Keiei had noticed this back when he arrived here, and Sebastian had purposely stayed away from him. Sebastian was surprised that Keiei had figured it out. But the guy said that alchemists were able to see the essence of not only things but also people. Like the fact that Sebastian had been intensely hiding something from him all this time, and his facial expression only confirmed that theory. The hero laughed and asked him not to take his words so literally, because Sebastian had done such hard work serving his grandfather. Sebastian thought that the guy intended to joke with him, but that wasn't the case. The hero realized that he expected Keiei to run away from his problems and leave this land. Sebastian didn't know what to answer, and Keiei could agree that he was a child but also an aristocrat. His father was sick, his grandfather was dead, and his great-uncle was too old to fulfill his duties. I wonder what would happen to this place if he escaped. Initially he didn't care about it, but a lot of time passed and he changed his views. The hero was determined to pay off this huge debt and save the land with people with money, managing the land and taking care of the people. Perhaps, then, when the economy in the lands worked properly. Some commoners despised money, saying that it defiled the human soul, but those who said so were far from being saints, but real fools. Money could bring both good and misfortune, and it only depended on how people used it. Every man was willing to fight for the gold coin in their hands, and for good reason. Their lives depended on money, but Keiei still saw money as a mirror that could reflect people's true nature. He flipped a coin and it fell on his hand. Therefore, the hero would want Sebastian to continue to support his decision, because he wanted to help people with this money and live a happy life. Sebastian realized that there was a terrible misunderstanding and expressed his regret to the young master. He saw the state the land was in, and he did not want the young master to spend his best years restoring a dead property. But it was very selfish to make that decision for him. Sebastian got down on his knee and apologized to the old man for his willfulness, but Keiei thought it was not his fault. Still, he was a very young man, so he would need the help of his elders, and he counted on Sebastian. The hero hoped that he would accept his request, and Sebastian promised to do his best, but they needed to prepare for tomorrow. Keiei smiled and said that he was right, so he relied on Sebastian. In the middle of the night, Keiei heard the creak of the door and the whisper of Aileen calling for the master. The hero did not understand why she had come to him again at night and remembered the last time she had come to perform the night service. He speculated that Sebastian might have sent her again. Meanwhile, Aileen had snuck up on Mr. Keiei and apologized to him for having no other way. The guy smirked, and he thought it was something new. As soon as the girl raised her hands, the guy ordered her to stop and she fell on the bed in front of him. Keiei didn't realize what she was doing this time, but as Catherine told her, it was the best thing she could do for him. Keiei asked her to understand what would have happened to her if she had kidnapped him. She would have been caught anyway. Tomorrow he was going to march through the lands to solve the unrest, but he wouldn't be fighting on the front lines. Besides, he would be traveling with Goliath, Jeff, and the other knights. In that case, Aileen wanted to go with him, for he needed to be looked after and cared for. Keiei asked her to understand that a defenseless girl would be out of place there, for she could be kidnapped by enemies or worse. Still, Aileen didn't understand why he didn't want to take her with him. But that was out of the question, for she had nothing to do on the battlefield. Still, the girl assumed that Keiei must have been scared, and he would be lying if he said he felt no fear at all. But if he continued to turn a blind eye to the bandits' rampage, they would all be in danger, and he couldn't let that happen. The girl couldn't stand it and pounced into Lord Keiei's arms, barely holding back her tears. She was too worried about him and confessed that if he left and didn't come back, her heart would stop. Keiei became uncomfortable and thought she would rather strangle him with her breasts. He asked her to calm down, for he was not going to die there. He reminded her that he had never deceived her and put his hands on her shoulders. Before Aileen could say anything, Kane kissed the surprised girl on the lips, and in that case he wished to take a promise that she would believe in him and wait for him, and Aileen promised. Still, she wanted to say something to him, but Kane reminded her that she had given her word, so now she was obliged to keep it. Aileen blushed and said she wanted to do him some good. Let him age, he would ask for something else, but for now he would like to ask to sleep on her lap. The hero hoped she didn't mind, and the girl was happy to let him rest on her lap for as long as Mr. Kane wished. The next morning came and Kane went to the neighboring villages where, under approving speeches of a bright future, he called for those who could fight. He divided the inhabitants into two groups. Those who were old and infirm, women with children or for some reason incapacitated, could go to the Carlier's mansion for help. The second, young men of sturdy build would be able to take up arms. Thus, Kane gathered 300 more soldiers and made Goliath the general of the army. At this point, the lands of Carlier were in a state of turmoil. This was due to banditry and rebellions from other villages in the northwest. With the exception of the east, there were numerous riots in the south and parts of the north, so Kane decided to take matters into his own hands. Meanwhile, the Carlier troops were joined by reinforcements that Sebastian had been gathering all night. These men were all willing to help the young lord, and they had previously served Grandpa Leopold. They were warriors, old school. Under the leadership of Captain Albert, 30 more talented warriors joined the troops of the Carlier family. In no time, Kane had acquired excellent warlords who also had their own soldiers. Altogether they had 500 new warriors. The army of infantrymen was led by Goliath, and the 500 cavalrymen were under Jeff. Kane first decided to suppress the area with the least amount of unrest, and that was the eastern stronghold of the Carlier family. He gathered his hand into a fist and suggested that everyone show their strength of the Carlier family and crush the enemies. With this order, the infantry under the leadership of Goliath conquered the villages one by one. Later, the hero was told that Goliath's army had taken possession of the eastern castle, which was excellent. As a result, the East now belonged to them, and the hero wanted to hear suggestions for next steps. The suggestion was made by a 65-year-old former knight of the guard, Alberto. If the East had fallen, they could finally communicate with the inhabitants and vassals that ruled here. A rough estimate of the numbers before consisted of about 67,000 men, and the current one had decreased by about 10,000. They could now move their headquarters to the very center of the East. The warrior asked to be sent with Jeff to the north and Goliath to the south. The weakness of the rebels was offset by their numbers, but that was not a problem for them. The low number of knights was due to their lack of combat training. Kane thought that they were quite talented and was glad that there were still such people left. It was only because of Sebastian that he met them, and the butler was embarrassed. He explained that they had all followed Kane voluntarily, having seen his aspirations. After the victory over the East, the headquarters of the Carlier family was moved to the very center. The army continued to crush the rebellion with unprecedented speed. It had been a month since Kane had left the mansion, and very soon at this rate they were to face their strongest opponents. Kane decided that their business north and south was going fine, and pretty soon Jeff and Goliath were due back. Guy told the warriors that they wouldn't have made such progress if they hadn't been here, and it was entirely to their credit. He had no money, no power, no combat experience, but he wished to bring peace to these lands, and they all wished it. That's why they rallied so united and accomplished so much. Kane probably thought that they would have followed his orders without question if he hadn't actually been powerful. The old man had been watching him for a month, and he was definitely an unusual aristocratic youth. He had that spirit of Leopold Carlier in him. He showed respect for them and always listened to any of their words, advice, praise, and criticism. But there was one difference between them nonetheless. Leopold stood at the head of the army and fought side by side with the soldiers, whereas Kane was well aware of his weaknesses and therefore asks for help from those who are strong in it, utilizing to the best of his ability all the resources he has. Undoubtedly, this was the behavior of an ideal commander. Alberto would say that he did an excellent job of being a commander, which was what got them to this point. Kane smiled and admitted that his praise gave him hope. Suddenly, Lord Kane was informed that an army of 300 men had secretly made their way to their tent, and the old man asked him to leave the defense on them and flee. The lad immediately thought that a dozen commanders wouldn't be able to handle them, but he had no intention of running away. Alberto couldn't believe that Kane had any intention of fighting. Kane smiled and said that was true, but it was not he who would be the one participating in the battle. The generals could not understand what Kane was up to, and the hero said that they would see everything now. The guy applied the magic of alchemy and created clay golems. The hero suggested using these guys as vanguard. They were made of clay, so nothing would happen to them. All the generals were shocked that Keiei could control the golems. Several more new golems emerged from the ground and they looked pretty intimidating. In that case, Alberto thought they could handle them and swore to protect Lord Keiei. The boy grinned and also promised to help them. But Keiei didn't understand when golems could become so gigantic and assumed that his alchemy had improved from that weapon trick. The rebel soldiers, upon seeing the golems outside the headquarters, ran in terror away, screaming that there were monsters. The commanders laughed and ordered their enemies to run straight into their clutches. Keiei ordered the rest of the warriors to wait for them at the exit of the forest. The brave warriors quickly crushed the enemy resistance, and for them the enemies moved like amateurs and were too inattentive. Albedo shouted that they were mere amateurs without a commander, and no mercy would be shown to those who encroached upon their lord. Cavalry Commander Alberto experienced a terrible adrenaline rush, as if he had fallen into a memory from 20 years ago. He rushed forward, cleaving the air with his sword. Alberto thought that these fools could overpower them by running another way, but ended up falling right into a trap. Just as Lord Keiei had predicted, Alberto didn't understand how Keiei could be so smart at that age. After all, he had a grandson his age, and he didn't even look a fraction like him. While he was thinking about this, Lord Keiei called out to Sir Alberto, telling him it was over. Important news reached the others. Mr. Jeff's cavalry army, now in complete control of the north. The south was also under the control of Mr. Goliath's infantrymen. Today at noon, the heads of the troops intended to go to the main headquarters to personally distinguish themselves on the progress. Alberto told Mr. Keiei that now they had one last push left, was the battle with the west, and Keiei believed it was all thanks to all of them. But Alberto was sure they were not worthy of such praise. A Zen walked into Keiei's tent and couldn't understand what the guy was forgetting here. The hero suggested that Zen go back to the mansion if he didn't like the conditions here. Zen thought that was rather rude of him. After all, he was just worried about the lone lord. In the midst of all this chaos, he was all alone, and Keiei decided not to argue with Zen. The hero wasn't going to die here anyway. Besides, luck had favored them. But now their army was only 20,000 men, and the enemy had 25,000. Zen reminded that in addition, there were capable warriors like Jeff, Goliath, and the rest among them. Jeff had said that Sebastian was much stronger than him, and in a critical situation, they could use his forces. More importantly, at the moment, their army has a territorial and numerical advantage. But they must also be prepared for the possibility that the soldiers might flee. Zen remembered with horror the incident where the soldiers had fled the battlefield when they first arrived in this land. It was true, but Keiei couldn't blame them, for these men were just ordinary farmers, without any military training, and they should have been prepared for such an outcome. The nobles had a responsibility to their subordinates and citizens, but they would deal with it if it happened. Zen decided it was rather troublesome, and he thought it was enough for the commanders to just sit in the tent. That was why Keiei didn't want to be here, because if he had a choice, he wouldn't be standing here. The boy sighed heavily and decided that he could at least complain to Zen. Now Mr. Keiei was more like the Zen of his carefree young master, but Zen suggested that if the West fell, it could be considered that the turmoil was over. All was true, but the western lands were the most troublesome, for there the army of the Count of Palladium had encamped. The Earl convinced the people of the West that he was absorbing the territories of the Carlier family to protect them from the Lord's oppression. Though they have control over the eastern, southern, and northern lands, their army numbers over 25,000. And most of them are ordinary peasants. But the Earl had a trained army with warriors under 20,000 men, and even if they attacked him from all sides, would suffer too many casualties. The hero had already sent a proposal for peace talks, but as expected, Count Palladium ignored it, which only meant that a direct clash was inevitable. If they did not conquer the West, they could not change these lands. The Count believed that Leopold was dead, and no matter how many peasants Keiei gathered for himself, he would prove to him that Lord Carlier's era was over. Meanwhile, the hero told the generals that they were advancing to the western lands. Two armies, the Carlier family's army of 25,000 men, and the Count Palladium's army of 20,000 men, would very soon clash on the hilly terrain. But the Carlier army is mostly made up of peasants, whereas the Count Palladium's is made up of trained warriors. Keiei was well aware that at this rate they could lose. The infantry led by Goliath was doing quite well, surprisingly to Keiei. Goliath shouted that this was their land and homeland, and so they would fight their enemies to their last breath. It was the spirit of perseverance and unity of the ordinary peasants that helped them make it this far. Jeff realized that the current opponents were far more dangerous than the past ones, and that their army would not last long against the real warriors. Alberto said that Jeff was showing progress, but if the battle dragged on, they were unlikely to win it. As Keiei thought breaking through to the Earl's land would be hard and they had to use the strength of the Goliath infantry, he asked for the infantry to be sent to Jeff. Also, Keiei asked to summon the Keiei here. Keiei ordered Goliath's infantry to march to the aid of Jeff's troop, giving as much support as he could and raising morale. His younger brother Keiei, on the other hand, was commanded with his undercover detachment to visit every village where the enemy army was stationed and to set fire to the storehouses to reduce the effectiveness of the army in battle. Keiei planned to lower the enemy's morale and hope of victory by such actions, but that is not how things turned out. The Count was furious and wanted to obtain victory at any cost, spending a fortune to replenish the army. A soldier reported to Lord Keiei that their reinforcements had increased by another 20,000 men, and the hero could not understand what the Count of Palladium was up to. He clearly didn't know when he should have stopped. The lad asked everyone to assemble and decided that they would get rid of his entire army in one battle. The hero had also not sat still for all those 3 days, and he was sure that the Count would regret it. When reinforcements came upon Lord Keiei's army, they were met by Goliath's infantrymen charging forward without a fraction of fear. Goliath demanded the enemy to attack them and was just waiting for it. He took a huge axe in his hand that Lord Keiei himself had made and demanded to feel the full power of Goliath. All the warriors replenished their fighting spirit and decided that they should also push on. The commander remarked that the Goliath was good enough that he was able to break through to the very center. He told Jeff that on them, in that case, would be the right and left flank, and Jeff listened to the commander. Even in front of an army of 40,000 men, the men had not drained their morale. Keiei asked to keep driving their enemy into the right position. Keiei's plan was to drive the entire army into a makeshift cage of spiked barricades. This trap was prepared for about 3 days, for it required a great deal of effort to set up. To confuse the frightened soldiers, Keiei also created a couple of golems to block any escape routes. Thus, half of the Count's army was frightened and unable to orient themselves with their surroundings. Keiei told Goliath that they had one last fight left and offered to break the spirit of these soldiers and go home. Goliath was willing to do this, just so long as they gave him a horse, and then he would slaughter every one of them. Seated on a sturdy horse, Goliath introduced himself as the general of the army of the Carlier family and demanded the general leading their army to come out to him. An intimidating large figure appeared among the soldiers, and General Blaze Duraf of the army of the Palladium family Blaze Duraf stepped out to the enemy. He exclaimed that Old Man Carlier was no longer in this world, and their children and women were starving and dying in poverty. But if they obeyed the Count Palladium, they would all disperse peacefully. Goliath did not know what their count was thinking, but they were the proud inhabitants of these lands and would decide for themselves who their ruler was. His lord was Keiei Carlier, an intelligent young man capable of revitalizing these lands, and he was unwilling to submit to the rotten aristocrats who intimidated the people, wanting only glory and dominance. In that case, he made his choice, and the Count said he would kill him and Lord Keiei with this spear, which had already taken 7 lives of great warriors of the Carlier army. With his words, Goliath drew his great axe and headed for his opponent. The Count also aimed his spear at the enemy and ordered the Goliath to prepare for death. But the Goliath was determined to show him what ordinary peasants were capable of. The two generals came face to face and the Goliath cut the Count's spear in half. The helmet on the surprised Count's face cracked, and he could not understand how he could have lost to him with one blow. With these thoughts, the shocked Count fell from his horse to the ground. It was just that the Goliath's axe was moving at an unprecedented speed, and it was far from one squishy blow. Goliath shouted to his enemies that their army general Blaze had been defeated by him and whoever disagreed with him could avenge his death. The army general was shocked, not realizing how he had killed Blaze himself. Somehow the redneck was able to kill the invincible general, and the army mistook him for a monster. They realized they couldn't do it if even the general couldn't handle him. Keiei thought about the fact that they killed their general instilled fear in them and they lost all desire to fight. That was true for the moment, but they could have a new commander and become a threat again. Keiei wanted to make sure they were doing the right thing, and Alberto said they were, because that was the reality of war. All these soldiers were different from Goliath and them, and they would go to slaughter again and again. After all, the Earl of Palladium ignored their letter, and this is the result of their lord's choice. Keiei realized that if he loosened his grip for even a second, this army could take advantage of it. Keiei desired peace and prosperity for the land, and for that he was willing to take all of his family's sins upon himself and get even with them. Goliath shouted to his enemies that apparently they had nothing to say, but they themselves were guilty of ignoring their lord's kindness. But that kindness was responded to by Jeff, Goliath, Keiei, and many other warlords under Alberto's leadership. The Earl of Palladium's army was falling by the second. In the name of Lord Kane, the commanders were not going to show any pity for their enemies. Thus, Kane Carlier was able to defeat the prepared trained army of the Earl of Palladium. He was grateful to each and every one of them, for they had eliminated the main problem of the Count Palladium's army. Even though they had not completely outnumbered every single soldier, the story of this battle would spread through the Count's lands with unprecedented speed. Lord Kane had incredible weaponry, and they also have immortal giants in their army. Just as Kane had anticipated, rumors of the strength of the Carlier army quickly spread throughout the lands of Count Palladium. But the problem still hovered in the air, and Kane feared that the angry Count, unhappy with such a defeat, would send his entire army of 100,000 warriors into battle. And to avoid this, at the very last minute, Kane sent a messenger to the Earl's land with a new offer of truce. And that messenger was the court sorceress Marin Ruffs. The girl told the Lord that if they refused this truce, it could be seen by her personally as aggression towards her dear friend. Apparently, the Earl understood this perfectly well and had no objection. Since the girl still hadn't repaid him for saving her friend, she was willing to help Kane. The guy was even scared to imagine what would have happened if he hadn't saved Lord Meow that day, and apparently God was on his side. Barely had he mentioned God as Opria appeared in front of him again. Kane was not thrilled to see that moth before him again. The girl smiled and said that he was awkwardly showing his love again. Apparently, Opria already knew about Marin's success and came to show him the tableau. Finally, they had significant results, and the personal popularity and faith of the people continued to grow relentlessly. Thanks to his decisions, healthcare had increased significantly, and Kane saw no surprise in this, for he had dealt with the Palladium. But he was more concerned with why flooding, agriculture, and commerce had declined. He suggested that it might have been because of the war. Enterprises, on the contrary, increased, and the girl reminded him that he was creating weapons and golems. Opria said that he had forgotten to pay attention to the most important thing, because no matter how one looked at it, their debt had mowed down, and it was wonderful. The western region was full of rich merchants that decided to join the Palladium, so Kane sent them into exile and took the money. The girl was surprised and said it was cruel. But Kane thought that the enemies were the real monsters. They profited from war and more ordinary people, and of course they were punished for it. In fact, these people had gone over to the enemy's side. Guy couldn't say that they were completely evil, but they still did bad things. He suggested that it might have been their own fault for not addressing them immediately. In any case, it was an eye for an eye, and it was their own fault that they decided to go to the enemy and make fortunes from the wretched. Kane decided that he would spend the money to pay off his debt, and Opria realized that the hero was not so white and fluffy. Kane said that such words might have hurt his heart, but the girl asked him to try not to act so cruelly to people again. But since she said not to do it, she could have given money for it. But the girl reminded him that he had promised. The hero sighed heavily and thought about how tired he was. The man apologized to Mr. Kane and decided to make sure he was still awake. Kane allowed him to enter and asked him to put tea here. The man asked to drink the tea while it was still hot, and the hero frowned. He didn't recall them having a guy with a squeaky voice and a frail build. Besides, he didn't see any sugar here, and the man said he added the sugar right away to the tea, so the hero didn't have to worry about that. Kane replied that he had miscalculated, for he did not drink tea with sugar, and asked the man who he was. The stranger immediately drew his swords. The man tried to attack the Kane, and the guy decided to find out what he was doing. But apparently the stranger did not listen to him, and Kane defended himself with all the means at hand. If the hero had known this would happen to him, he would have bought a jiu-jitsu book on sale in a past life. The little goddess tried to knock the stranger on the head, thus confusing him. She ordered him not to dare attack her baby Kine. The boy tried all sorts of ways to drive the Odia away from him, but he couldn't hit her. The hero was surprised that the mercenary could see the Opria, and thought this was his chance. It was about time to apply an equal exchange, and when he controlled alchemy, he had control over everything. Thus, the hero created a sword from a rack of candles. Now he could fight him on equal terms, but suddenly he noticed that his tent was on fire. Everyone outside was concerned about Lord Kane. Zen, along with the warlord, ran in to see Lord Kane, asking what was wrong. The guy explained that he had been infiltrated by an assassin, but now he had nowhere to run to. The mercenary found himself surrounded by a bunch of soldiers who ordered him to lay down his weapons or they would use force. The mercenary remained silent, and apparently he chose the second option. Kane had captured the mercenary, and the soldiers were glad that Mr. Kane had handled it. Now they had to put out the fire and interrogate the mercenary. Much to Kane's surprise, the assassin turned out to be a girl. She was also about his age, and he didn't understand what she was doing here. With tears in her eyes, she cried out that it was all their fault. She was a member of the LaFour company from whom they had taken everything away and sent everyone into exile. But she apparently didn't know that their company had joined the Palladium County and they were sponsoring the continuation of the war. Many villages were burned because of them, and they could not be counted. Many innocents were killed and this company continued to profit from it. The girl looked questioningly at Kane, not sure what he meant. The hero regarded such behavior as a betrayal of the Carlier family and asked to be glad that he didn't take their lives, but just left them with nothing. It seemed to the girl that he was too calm to say such terrible things as a child. She only regretted not being able to slit his throat and was close to doing so. The hero wanted to know what her connection to this company was and asked for her name. The girl's name was Sheila. She was a servant of Mistress Lillian, but this was the first time the lad had heard the name. The Lord respected his grandfather, and even when that fatty came to power, he continued to sponsor him. But when the gentleman ran out of money altogether, the Carlier family turned their backs on him. But not Mrs. Lillian. She was kidnapped by bandits and sold into slavery, and Sheila didn't know where she was. She asked Kane to remember that even if she died here, she would be returned to him by a vengeful spirit again and again until he died. The warlord decided to gag her and put a gag in her mouth, dropping the girl to the ground. He offered Lord Kane to get rid of her and put a sword to her throat, but Kane asked him to wait. Kane felt sorry that this had happened to her lord, so he wished he could ignore her hostility and find Lillian. And until he finds Lillian, she will spend time in the dungeon of his mansion to cool her ardor a bit. The boy asked the warlord to treat the captive with respect and tears came to the girl's eyes. The commander asked the young master to apologize, for if he had noticed the girl earlier, there would have been no problem. But Kane asked not to apologize, for he himself had asked to be left alone. The debts of the family could not be repaid by ordinary means. Realizing this, Kane wondered what sacrifices he was capable of making to keep his life and these lands. But his affairs were going better than he thought and the next step had to be planned. Guy told Zen that now was the time to return to the mansion and Zen was in agreement with him. For over a month Kane and his army had been fighting at the front and it had been about 7 days since news of the victory in the west. Lydia was glad that Lord Kane was finally coming home. Palladium County had been defeated and the bandits were finished, and now he would definitely be here. Aileen only wondered how soon he would arrive. Another maid ran up to them and started spreading rumors that Lord Kane had been attacked by an assassin. Alan hoped he was alright, and the girl said he was. He defeated the villain with the help of his alchemy. Aileen sighed heavily, and Lydia didn't understand what their friend was doing. After all, she had only calmed Aileen down with good news. Linda took the rascal by the ear and told her they were going to clean the kitchen. The girl asked her to let go, for she was in pain. While Aileen was cleaning up the yard, a wind blew in her direction and she heard the sounds of hooves, which only meant that the Lord had returned to the mansion. The carriage stopped not far from Aileen and out of it stepped Mr. Kane. He could agree that it was always a pleasure to return to a home where he was welcome. Aileen hugged the hero and rejoiced that he had returned safe and sound. Even though Kane had promised her that he would return, she was still worried about him. The boy also hugged the girl and told her that he was home now.